The October wind cut through Shelby, Montana like a knife through winter wheat, carrying the first snow of the season in sideways sheets that turned Main Street into a blur of white and gray. Ellen Merrick sat in the furthest chair from the desk in Franklin Pierce's law office, her calloused hands folded in her lap, watching three men in clean Carhartt jackets settle into seats closer to where the inheritance would be divided. The radiator hissed and clanked in the corner, fighting a losing battle against the cold seeping through single-pane windows that had witnessed 50 years of estate settlements. And Ellen counted the clanks the way she used to count her husband's breaths in the hospital 3 years ago, before the counting stopped mattering. Carter Merrick occupied the chair nearest the lawyer's desk, his large frame making the furniture seem delicate, the way working men always made indoor spaces feel temporary. At 47, he had their father's weathered face and careful movements, the eldest son who'd spent 26 years walking behind machinery and watching horizons for weather that could destroy a season's work in 15 minutes. His wife Carol sat beside him, her nurse's uniform visible under an open coat, the fabric still carrying the antiseptic smell of the night shift she'd finished 4 hours ago. She'd driven straight from the hospital in Great Falls because family obligation demanded presence, even when exhaustion made her eyes red and her hands shake slightly when she reached for the coffee Franklin's secretary had poured. Wade Merrick sat to Carter's right, ankles crossed, one boot tapping an impatient rhythm against the chair leg that made everyone else in the room aware of his restlessness. 44 years old and already going soft around the middle despite ranch work that should have kept him lean. He dressed up for the occasion in new Wranglers and a pearl snap shirt that his wife Denise had probably picked out during one of her shopping trips to Billings. Everything about Wade announced success before success had actually arrived, a habit that would eventually cost him everything. Though on this Wednesday afternoon in 1977, he still believed the inheritance would prove he'd been right to expand, to borrow, to bet on wheat prices that couldn't possibly stay low forever. Boone Merrick had positioned himself by the window, as if proximity to the outside might offer escape from whatever verdict their father's will contained. At 42, he was the youngest son and still moved like someone waiting for permission to leave, the legacy of being last in a family where birth order determined everything from bedroom assignments to whose opinion mattered at the dinner table. He kept glancing at his watch, though everyone knew this meeting had no time limit but the one Franklin Pierce set, and Franklin had been reading wills long enough to know that rushing grief only made it curdle into something worse. Ellen had taken the chair furthest from the desk, not out of deference but calculation. From here she could see all three brothers without turning her head, could watch their reactions when Franklin read the distribution clause, could measure what she'd already suspected she'd find. At 40 years old, she'd learned to take up less space than she deserved, a skill born from 2 decades of hearing that ranches passed to sons, that daughters got recipes and maybe a piece of jewelry if the deceased felt sentimental. Her wedding ring was gone, sold 3 years ago to pay for Jack's funeral after the tractor rolled, and the life insurance company found reasons not to pay, and the pale band of skin on her finger had finally tanned to match the rest of her hand. She wore her best dress, navy blue with white piping, conservative enough for church and formal enough for the redistribution of everything her father had spent 76 years building. Franklin Pierce cleared his throat, the sound deliberate and practiced, a lawyer's way of calling attention without raising his voice. He'd opened the file folder before him, thick with papers that represented Robert Merrick's life condensed into legal language and witness signatures. At 69, Franklin carried himself with the formal distance of a man who'd learned not to show preference when dividing up what dead men left behind. The ceiling fan overhead squeaked on every third rotation, a sound Ellen had been counting since she sat down 20 minutes ago, and outside someone drove past with a radio playing Waylon Jennings, the sound Doppler shifting away into the storm. The will of Robert James Merrick, executed September 2, 1977, witnessed and notarized according to Montana state law. Franklin's voice carried no inflection, a neutral instrument reading words another man had chosen. The standard opening followed: sound mind and final wishes, revocation of all previous wills and codicils, the legal framework that transformed a life into distributable assets. Ellen let the words wash over her, her attention fixed on her brothers instead. Carter's jaw had tightened. Wade's boot had stopped tapping. Boone had abandoned the window and moved closer, as if the specific phrasing of inheritance required proximity to become real. To my son, Carter Eugene Merrick, I leave the North Ranch, 520 acres including all buildings, improvements, and water rights appurtenant thereto. Franklin paused, adjusted his reading glasses. Said property is subject to an existing mortgage of $38,000 with First Security Bank of Shelby, which mortgage shall pass with the property. The terms are variable rate, currently 9.2% annually. Carter's face went still in a way that told Ellen the mortgage was news to him. Their father had taken out debt in his final years and never mentioned it, had let Carter assume the inheritance came free, and clear the way their grandfather's land had passed down in 1945. The first crack in the foundation, though none of them knew it yet. Carol's hand found Carter's and squeezed, a gesture of solidarity that Ellen recognized from her own marriage, back when Jack was alive and small gestures could still communicate entire conversations. To my son, Wade Christopher Merrick, I leave the East Ranch, 520 acres, including all buildings, improvements, and water rights appurtenant thereto, free and clear of all encumbrances. Wade's shoulders settled back, and Ellen watched him calculate land value at current prices. $300 per acre meant $156,000 in assets, wealth enough to borrow against, to leverage into the expansion he'd been planning since he bought that new John Deere swather in '75. The math was simple and seductive, the kind that made men feel rich before the market reminded them that feeling and being were different things. To my son, Boone Michael Merrick, I leave the South Ranch, 520 acres, including all buildings, improvements, and water rights appurtenant thereto, free and clear of all encumbrances. Boone's exhale was audible, relief so pure it was almost painful to witness. The youngest son still getting land, still welcomed into the legacy that 3 generations of Merrick men had carved from prairie grass and stubbornness. Ellen saw him doing the same math Wade had just finished, saw the possibilities unfurling in his expression. The inheritance meant he could quit his job at the feed lot in Cut Bank, could move back full-time, could reclaim what he'd been working toward since he was 16 and first drove a tractor in a straight line. Franklin's pause lasted 3 seconds longer than necessary, and something in the quality of that silence made Ellen's stomach tighten. His eyes found hers across the desk, and what passed between them might have been apology, or might have been the studied neutrality of a man who'd been doing this too long to let emotion complicate his job. To my daughter, Ellen Marie Merrick, I leave my 1967 International Harvester TD-14 bulldozer, serial number 21437, and the Northwest 80 acres commonly known as the Badlands parcel, including all mineral rights and water rights appurtenant thereto, free and clear of all encumbrances. The silence that followed had texture and weight, thick enough that breathing required effort. The ceiling fan completed 2 full rotations, squeak, 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 squeak. Outside, a magpie called from the cottonwood tree shading Franklin's parking lot, 3 harsh notes that sounded like mockery or maybe just the indifference of nature to human drama. Carter spoke first, his voice careful and too quiet, That's it. Ellen gets a dozer and 80 acres of wasteland. The Badlands won't grow anything. Dad tried for 30 years. Franklin consulted the document again, though everyone knew he'd read it correctly the first time. That's what the will stipulates. The ranch land is divided equally among the three sons, 520 acres each, totaling 1,560 acres. Ms. Merrick receives the 1967 bulldozer and the Northwest 80. Wade's laugh came out surprised but not cruel, just the sound of someone processing arithmetic that didn't add up the way family should. The laugh died when nobody joined him, when the math of the inheritance settled into stark relief. 1,560 acres at $300 per acre meant $468,000 in real estate, divided three ways among three men. One bulldozer manufactured 10 years earlier, worth maybe $5,000 if someone wanted it badly enough, and 80 acres of eroded gullies that couldn't support sagebrush, let alone wheat. Boone moved away from the window, confusion evident in every line of his posture. His voice came out uncertain, as if he suspected he'd misheard. Dad left Ellen a dozer and land that's worthless, while we each got working ranches. That seems, he paused, searching for a word that wouldn't sound cruel, unbalanced. The distribution is clear and legally sound. Franklin closed the folder but kept his hand on it, a gesture that suggested finality while also indicating he had more to say. There are a few additional items. The farm equipment not specifically bequeathed, the swather, the grain trucks, the smaller implements, are to be sold with proceeds going to estate settlement and remaining debts. Personal effects are to be divided among all 4 children as they see fit. He reached into his desk drawer and extracted a smaller envelope, cream-colored and sealed with red wax that had been pressed with a signet ring Ellen recognized as her grandfather's, the one with the Merrick family crest that had come over from somewhere in Scotland in 1892. Franklin held the envelope out across the desk, and Ellen noticed his hand trembled slightly, though whether from age or the weight of what he was handing over, she couldn't tell. "Your father asked me to give you this privately, Ms. Merrick. His instructions were specific. You are not to open it in this office, and its contents are not part of the probated will. This is," he paused, choosing words carefully, "a personal communication." Ellen stood and crossed to the desk, aware of 3 pairs of eyes tracking her movement, aware that whatever was in that envelope mattered more than the inventory Franklin had just read. The paper felt expensive under her fingers, the kind of stationery her father had never used for anything practical, which meant whatever he'd written had required ceremony he normally avoided. Her name appeared on the front in his blocky handwriting, the letters formed with the same stubbornness that had characterized everything Robert Merrick had ever done. She slipped it into her purse without comment, though the weight of it seemed disproportionate to its actual mass. Carter stood as well, his chair scraping against the floor loud enough to make Denise flinch. His face had gone through shock and was landing somewhere in the territory of guilt, which was almost worse than anger would have been. This isn't right. Ellen should get more. She worked that ranch as much as any of us, more than Boone, who's been in Cutbank for 6 years. Franklin's expression remained professionally blank. The will is valid and properly executed. If you wish to contest the distribution, that's your prerogative, though I'd advise against it unless you have clear grounds. Montana law favors testamentary intent, and your father was of sound mind when he executed this document. 3 witnesses can attest to that. Ellen found her voice steadier than she'd expected. "I'm not contesting anything. The will is what it is. Dad made his choices, and I'll live with them." Wade shifted in his seat, and the movement drew everyone's attention. He'd been quiet since his aborted laugh, but now something calculating had entered his expression, the look of a man working through implications and finding advantages. Dad knew what he was doing. Land goes to those who can work it. That's how it's always been done. Women marry ranchers. They don't become them. The condescension in his tone landed exactly as intended, a small violence dressed up as tradition. Ellen met his eyes and held them until he looked away, a minor victory that cost more than it should have. She turned back to Franklin, ignoring the heat climbing her neck, ignoring the familiar weight of being dismissed that she'd carried since she was 16, and told her father she wanted to study agriculture at Montana State. "When can I take possession of the bulldozer?" Franklin consulted his notes. "The equipment is currently stored in the machine shed on the North Ranch. You're welcome to remove it at your convenience, though I'd suggest coordinating with Carter given that it's on his property now." Carter nodded, his earlier guilt crystallizing into something that looked like determination. "You can take it whenever you want. And Ellen, if you need help moving it," or he paused, and Ellen could see him working through an offer that his wife would probably object to later, "if you need anything, you let me know." The generosity was real but insufficient, and they both knew it. Ellen thanked him anyway, because Carter was trying and that was more than Wade or Boone were managing, and because family obligation ran both ways even when inheritance didn't. Franklin began the administrative details then, probate timeline and tax considerations, deadlines for equipment sales, information that washed over Ellen like background noise. Her attention had drifted to the window where snow continued to fall. October in Montana, announcing winter the way it always did, early and without apology. She'd spent 18 years working alongside her father on those 1,560 acres, had learned equipment maintenance before Wade figured out which end of a wrench to hold, had kept books more accurate than any accountant in Toole County, had scouted fields and made decisions about when to plant and when to wait that had saved thousands of dollars through attention and timing. And her inheritance was a bulldozer that weighed 22 tons and 80 acres of land so damaged by erosion that even cattle wouldn't graze it. The meeting dissolved into handshakes and murmured condolences, though the real work of grief had happened earlier, in the 3 days between her father's heart attack and this Wednesday afternoon division of everything he'd built. Ellen found herself standing in the parking lot while her brothers clustered near Carter's truck, having a conversation that didn't include her but was probably about her. The snow had intensified, fat flakes that stuck to everything, and made the world look clean despite the mud underneath. She walked to her vehicle, a 1973 Ford pickup that had been Jack's before the accident, the truck she'd been driving for 3 years through every weather Montana could produce. The door handle was cold enough to burn, and when she slid behind the wheel, the vinyl seat cracked under her weight, the upholstery split from too many seasons of heat and cold. She started the engine and let it idle rough, the old straight six clattering in a way that meant she'd need to adjust the valves soon, another task on a list that never got shorter. Through the rear-view mirror she could see Wade gesturing, probably explaining to Carter and Boone how Ellen would sell the dozer, use the money as a nest egg, maybe find another husband who'd take care of her the way Jack had tried to before the tractor rolled. That's how these things went for women who outlived their usefulness as ranch wives, who were too old to remarry well and too poor to retire. The math was simple and depressing, the kind that made 40 feel like 60. Ellen pulled out of the parking lot and drove north on Highway 15, the road that connected Shelby to the rest of the world, through a series of small towns that existed, because wheat needed elevators and ranchers needed parts. The windshield wipers beat a rhythm against the snow, thump, 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 and she found herself counting the beats the way she'd counted the radiator clanks, the way she'd counted everything since Jack died, and the counting was all she had left to organize time that otherwise felt formless. Her trailer sat on the edge of what used to be the Merrick homestead, a 14 by 70 foot box that she'd bought used in 1975 after selling the house in Shelby that she and Jack had owned together. The trailer was small enough that heating it didn't bankrupt her, old enough that the monthly payment was $68, and isolated enough that nobody could hear her cry at night when the loneliness got so heavy it felt like drowning. She parked in the gravel pad out front and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, watching snow accumulate on the hood. Inside, the kitchen table had become her command center over the past month. Stacks of ranch records she'd photocopied before her father got too sick to notice, notebooks filled with calculations, a ledger that tracked every expense and revenue stream from the last 5 years. She'd been preparing for this, had known since her father's first heart attack in August that the will would go exactly as tradition dictated, and that she'd need a plan for after. The envelope emerged from her purse, the wax seal still intact. She broke it carefully, preserving the imprint of her grandfather's ring, some instinct telling her that 20 years from now she might want to remember what this moment felt like, might need physical evidence that it had actually happened. 2 pages of lined paper unfolded in her hands, covered in her father's handwriting that had grown shaky in places where his hands had started to fail, but the words came through clear enough. Ellen, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you're probably angry. You got a dozer in Badlands while your brothers got working ranches. Seems unfair, and maybe it is. I'm an old man with old ways, raised to believe ranches pass to sons the same way they passed to me and my father before that. That's tradition, and tradition is what kept this land in the family for 3 generations. I can't break that, not even for you, and I won't apologize for being too much a coward to try. But I know something your brothers don't know, something I need you to understand before you decide I was just another old bastard who thought women belonged in kitchens instead of on tractors. I know you're the best rancher of the 4. Better at numbers than Carter, who spent 26 years beside me. Better at equipment than Wade, who thinks new paint means good machinery. Better at seeing what's coming than Boone, who still doesn't understand that hope isn't a plan. The dozer is paid for. That's the key, Ellen. No debt means freedom. Your brothers will get land, but they'll also get the temptation to borrow against it. They'll think they're rich because they own ground, but ownership with debt is just another kind of renting. You start with less, but you start free. That's worth more than they know, more than you probably believe right now. The Badlands aren't what they seem. When I was 10 years old, my father took me to the northwest corner and made me dig a hole 6 feet deep. We hit gray clay at 4 feet, thick stuff that stuck to the shovel and wouldn't wash off in the creek. He told me it was bentonite, said engineers came during the war asking to mine it, but he refused because mining would destroy what little topsoil we had. He filled in the hole and told me never to dig there again, said some secrets were worth keeping. I kept that secret for 66 years, Ellen. Your brothers don't know about the clay. They don't know that bentonite is worth $40 a ton, and that every acre has maybe 3,000 tons of it sitting there under the erosion. They don't know because I never told them, because telling them would have meant they'd fight over it and you'd end up with nothing. The dozer is the tool you need to expose that clay. Terrace the Badlands right, stop the erosion, and you'll find what's underneath. Then you lease the mineral rights, not sell them, lease them, and you'll have income that doesn't depend on weather or wheat prices or luck. Your brothers will farm and borrow and hope. You'll dig and discover and build. I'm sorry I couldn't be braver. Sorry I couldn't tell the family and the neighbors and the whole damn county that my daughter was the best rancher I ever knew. But maybe this is better. Maybe starting with nothing except a tool and a secret is the greatest gift I could give you, because it means whatever you build will be yours in a way that inheritance never is. The land has secrets, Ellen. Dig for them, and forgive an old man who loved you enough to make you earn what your brothers will lose. Your father, Robert Merrick. Folded inside the second page were $500 bills, crisp enough that they stuck together, Money that had never been in a wallet or a cash register, but had come straight from a bank teller counting out a withdrawal. Ellen set them aside and read the letter twice more, looking for hidden meanings or clarifications that might soften the edge of what he'd actually said. He'd known she was the best rancher and given her the worst land anyway. Had chosen tradition over fairness and called it love. Had believed in her enough to give her a challenge instead of a gift, and the distinction between those two things felt too subtle for the anger building in her chest. She sat at the kitchen table as afternoon stretched toward evening, the letter in front of her and the money making a small pile near her right hand. The trailer was quiet except for the propane heater's hiss and the occasional creak of aluminum siding contracting in the cold. Through the window she could see the outline of Carter's barn 200 yards away, the buildings that used to be her father's and now belonged to her brother, the landscape of her childhood redistributed according to rules she'd never been allowed to question. Somewhere in the stillness, a decision began to crystallize. She could contest the will, spend money on lawyers and time on arguments that might result in a cash settlement and guaranteed bitterness. She could sell the dozer, take the $5,000 or whatever it brought, and start over in Havre or Great Falls doing bookkeeping or clerking at a feed store, trading the possibility of building something for the safety of a paycheck. She could do what Wade predicted, find a man willing to marry a 40-year-old widow with no inheritance, and let someone else make the decisions. Or she could prove her father right about her capabilities and wrong about his choices. Could take the tool he'd given her, and the secret he'd kept, and the 80 acres nobody wanted, and build something that would make tradition look like the cowardice it was. The knock on her door came just after 7, when the light had failed completely and Ellen had moved from the table to the propane heater, holding her hands over the flame because the cold had settled into her bones in a way that felt permanent. She wasn't expecting visitors, and when she opened the door to find Carter standing on her steps, snow dusting his hat and shoulders, surprise rendered her temporarily silent. "I wanted to check on you, make sure you were okay." His voice was gentle, the tone of someone who'd rehearsed what they wanted to say and was hoping the words came out right. "Carol's worried. Said you looked like you were holding yourself together with wire and spite." Ellen stepped back from the door, gesturing him inside though the trailer wasn't any warmer than the porch. Carter had to duck coming through the doorway, his height making the low ceiling feel oppressive, and when he settled onto the couch, it groaned under his weight in a way that made them both pretend not to notice. "I'm not contesting the will." Ellen's words came out flatter than she intended. "If that's what you came to talk about, you can save the speech." Carter shook his head, pulling off his hat and turning it in his hands, a nervous gesture she recognized from childhood. "I came to say that what Dad did was wrong. You deserved better than Badlands and a bulldozer, and I came to offer you something." He reached into his coat pocket and extracted an envelope, this one plain white and unsealed. Inside were $200 bills, more cash than Ellen had seen in one place since Jack's life insurance company finally paid out 6 months after the funeral. "That's $2,000. It's what I figure 80 acres of good land should be worth to even things out. I know it's not much compared to what I got, but it's what I can spare right now with the mortgage and Carol's car needing a new transmission. Take it. Use it for whatever you need. I can't fix what Dad did, but I can try to make it less wrong." Ellen stared at the money, at her brother's calloused hands holding it out like an offering or maybe an apology. The temptation was real and immediate. $2,000 would buy 6 months of safety, would let her plan instead of scramble, would prove that at least one person in the family thought she deserved more than scraps. But taking it would also mean accepting that the inheritance was unfair, that she needed charity to survive, that her father had been wrong and Carter was trying to correct it. And somewhere in the gap between those things, Ellen realized that accepting help now would poison whatever she managed to build later. People would say Carter gave her the steak. Wade would claim the family subsidized her. The story of what she accomplished would always have an asterisk, a note explaining that she'd needed rescue. I appreciate the offer. I really do. But I can't take it. Ellen pushed the envelope back across the coffee table that separated them, and Carter's face went through confusion into something that looked like respect, though it might have just been the dim light making her imagine what she wanted to see. You're really going to try to make something out of those badlands? Carter's question carried no mockery, just genuine curiosity about how anyone could look at 80 acres of erosion and see possibility. I'm going to terrace them, stop the gullies from getting worse, maybe find water if I drill deep enough. Ellen didn't mention the bentonite, didn't tell him what her father had written about clay deposits worth $40 a ton. Some secrets needed keeping a while longer until she knew whether they were truth or just an old man's final delusion. That'll take years, money you don't have. And even if you do it, even if you get those badlands producing, it's still only 80 acres. That's not enough to make a living. Carter spoke from experience, from 26 years of watching his father wrestle a living from 520 acres, knowing that scale mattered and that small operations died slowly unless someone had off-farm income or a spouse with a job in town. Then I'll figure out how to make 80 acres enough. Ellen stood, the conversation clearly finished, and Carter took the hint. He replaced his hat and moved toward the door, but paused with his hand on the frame, turning back with an expression that carried more weight than the words that followed. Dad used to say you had more stubbornness than all three of us boys combined. Said it like it was a fault, but I think maybe he knew it was the only thing that would save you. His voice carried an ache that Ellen recognized as regret for all the things their father should have said directly instead of leaving as breadcrumbs in letters and conversations with sons. Good luck, Ellen. I mean that. I hope you prove all of us wrong. After Carter left, Ellen returned to the kitchen table and pulled out a clean sheet of paper. The calculations came easily, muscle memory from years of helping her father plan crops and budget inputs. Terracing 80 acres would require 200 hours of dozer work, maybe more if the ground was frozen or wet. Fuel at 70 cents a gallon, burning 3 gallons an hour, meant $420 just to run the machine. She'd need surveying equipment to cut terraces at the right grade, need seed and fence, and some kind of irrigation if her father was right about finding water at 340 feet. The arithmetic was brutal. Developing the Badlands would cost at least $8,000, and that was assuming nothing broke, no equipment failed, no problems emerged that required solutions she couldn't improvise. She had $500 from her father's letter and $8,200 in savings from 3 years of living on widow's benefits and not much else. $12,700 total, which meant she could start but probably couldn't finish. Ellen worked until midnight, building scenarios and modeling different approaches, trying to find a path through the numbers that didn't require borrowing money she couldn't pay back. The propane heater cycled on and off, and somewhere in the dark hours she made coffee and drank it black because the powdered creamer had run out last week, and buying more seemed like an unnecessary expense. By the time she turned off the kitchen light and climbed into bed, she had a plan that was either brilliant or insane, and she wouldn't know which until spring when the ground thawed enough to move. The decision to start came in November, the week before Thanksgiving, when Carter called to say the family was gathering at his place for dinner, and Ellen was expected to attend. She almost declined, almost invented an excuse about not feeling well or needing to work. But something in Carter's voice suggested this wasn't optional, that the family needed to at least pretend they were still a family even after inheritance had sorted them into winners and losers. She arrived at Carter's ranch on Thursday afternoon, driving through the first serious snow of the season, the kind that accumulated fast enough to make her question whether the road back to her trailer would be passable by evening. The house looked exactly as it had when her father lived there, same windows and same paint, though Carol had added curtains that softened the harsh masculinity of a place built for function over comfort. Cars lined the driveway, Wade's new Silverado and Boone's older Ford, both trucks cleaner than any working vehicle should be, which told Ellen that appearances mattered more to her brothers than admission. Inside, the house smelled like turkey and pie, and the warmth hit her like a wall after the truck's anemic heater. Carol greeted her with a hug that lasted longer than politeness required, and Ellen realized Carter's wife had been genuinely worried, had probably spent the last month imagining Ellen alone in that trailer doing calculations that added up to surrender. The meal happened the way family meals do, with too much food and too little conversation about things that mattered. Wade held court about wheat prices and export markets, displaying knowledge that sounded impressive until Ellen realized he was just repeating what he'd read in the Farm Bureau newsletter. Boone talked about the feedlot in Cut Bank, about his plans to quit now that he had land, about how next year he'd be planting his own acres instead of working for wages. Nobody asked Ellen about her plans, and she didn't offer. It was during dessert, when Denise was serving pie and Carter was pouring coffee, that Boone's filter apparently failed. He'd been drinking since before dinner, beer and then whiskey, and the alcohol had loosened whatever restraint he normally practiced. His voice carried across the table, loud enough that everyone stopped their own conversations to listen. "So Ellen, you gonna terraform the moon with that dozer, or you got actual plans?" He grinned like it was a joke they'd all appreciate, like mockery was just another form of family affection. "Carol will probably farm rocks. That's about all those badlands are good for." The table went quiet. Wade looked into his coffee cup. Carter's jaw tightened. Denise smirked into her pie, enjoying the discomfort she hadn't created but was happy to witness. Ellen set down her fork carefully, the kind of careful that came before violence or cold precision, and when she spoke her voice carried across the room like winter wind under a door. "I'm going to terrace those 80 acres, cut benches that'll stop erosion and catch runoff. I'm going to drill a well and see if Dad was right about water at 340 feet. And then I'm going to prove that good management beats scale every single time, which is something you'll understand in about 5 years when you're trying to figure out how you lost everything you just inherited." Boone's grin faltered. Wade looked up from his coffee. Carter made a sound that might have been approval or might have been fear for what Ellen had just started. Denise stopped smirking. Ellen stood, thanked Carol for dinner, and walked out into the snow without putting on her coat. She made it to the truck before the shaking started, adrenaline and anger and fear mixing into something that felt like determination but might have just been spite. She sat behind the wheel watching snow accumulate on the windshield, and by the time she started the engine, she'd made a decision that would define the next 47 years. She was going to do exactly what she'd said. Terrace the badlands, find the water, expose the bentonite if it existed, and build something that would make her inheritance look like the gift it actually was instead of the insult everyone assumed. Not because she owed her father vindication, and not because she needed to prove anything to brothers who'd already decided she was destined to fail. She'd do it because the alternative was accepting that 40 years old, widowed and childless, meant the best parts of life were finished, and she wasn't ready to believe that yet. The first snow of winter fell heavy and silent, covering badlands and good ground equally, making everything look possible in the way that fresh snow always did. Ellen drove home through the storm, and somewhere in the white darkness between Carter's ranch and her trailer, the anger that had sustained her through dinner transformed into something colder and more useful. By the time she pulled into her gravel pad, she knew exactly what she'd do come spring. The dozer was parked in Carter's machine shed 200 yards away, waiting under a tarp for weather to break and ground to thaw. 80 acres of eroded wasteland sat under 6 inches of snow, holding secrets her grandfather had buried and her father had kept. She had $12,700, a bulldozer she barely knew how to operate, and a letter from a dead man telling her that freedom mattered more than wealth. It would have to be enough. Winter came hard to the High Line that year, the kind of cold that made metal brittle and diesel gel in fuel tanks, and reminded everyone that Montana had killed better men than those currently trying to ranch it. Ellen spent December and January in the machine shed at Carter's place, the bulldozer sitting massive and silent under fluorescent lights that hummed and flickered when the temperature dropped below zero. The International Harvester TD-14 was older than her marriage had been, manufactured in 1967, when she was still in high school, and the world seemed full of possibilities that didn't include standing alone at 40 in a freezing shed trying to learn how 22 tons of iron and diesel worked. The operator's manual was water-stained and missing pages, but what remained told her enough. 6 cylinders, turbocharged, 165 horsepower, designed to move earth in quantities that transformed landscape. She climbed into the seat on a Saturday morning when the thermometer read 8 below and Carter was in town buying parts for his swather. The metal was cold enough to burn through her gloves, and when she turned the key, nothing happened except a click that sounded like the machine's way of laughing at her presumption. Graham Foster found her there 3 hours later, still in the seat, still turning the key and pumping the throttle like repetition might overcome physics. He stood in the doorway of the shed, backlit by winter sun that made him a silhouette, and when he spoke his voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned that offering help to proud people required pretending it wasn't help at all. Glow plugs need 60 seconds in this cold. You're flooding it. His boots crunched on the concrete floor as he approached, and Ellen noticed he walked with a slight limp, the kind that came from old injury rather than age. He was maybe 54, with gray in his hair and lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than frowned, though he wasn't smiling now, just watching her with the clinical interest of someone solving a problem that didn't involve emotion. Ellen climbed down from the seat, her legs stiff from sitting in cold metal for 3 hours, and watched as Graham pulled himself up into the operator's position with the ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime around heavy equipment. He turned the key and held it, counting out loud to 60, then released and pressed the starter. The engine turned over once, twice, coughed black smoke from the exhaust stack, and settled into a rough idle that smoothed out as metal warmed and oil flowed. You'll want to let her warm up 20 minutes before you try to move. Cold hydraulic fluid is like cold honey. Push it too hard and you'll blow seals that'll cost $500 to replace. He climbed down and gestured for Ellen to take the seat, but she hesitated, suddenly aware that accepting this man's expertise meant acknowledging she didn't know what she was doing, that the dozer she'd inherited wasn't just a tool but a test she might not pass. I'm Graham Foster, Agricultural Extension Agent out of the Havre office. I heard Robert Merrick's daughter got the TD-14 and was planning to terrace the Badlands, and I figured anyone crazy enough to try that probably needed someone to explain how terracing actually works. He extended a hand that was work rough but clean, nails trimmed short in a way that suggested he paid attention to details most men ignored. Ellen shook his hand and felt calluses that matched her own, the specific pattern that came from wrenches and shovels and wire stretchers, tools that required grip strength and left their marks. I appreciate the offer, but I can't afford to pay for consulting. Whatever the extension service charges, it's more than I have to spare right now. Graham's laugh came out warm enough to make the shed feel less cold. Extension service is taxpayer-funded, which means you already paid for it. Consider this your return on investment. Besides, I've got nothing better to do on a Saturday than watch someone try to start a dozer that hasn't run in 3 years without dying of hypothermia. Seems like the neighborly thing to prevent. They spent the rest of that day in the shed, Graham explaining the controls while Ellen practiced moving the blade up and down, angling it left and right, feeling how the hydraulics responded with a lag that required anticipation. He taught her to read the ground, to see where water wanted to flow and where terraces needed to intercept it, to understand that moving earth wasn't about force, but about working with gravity instead of against it. When the light failed and the shed's heater couldn't keep up with the cold seeping through the walls, Graham helped her shut down the dozer properly, showed her how to drain the water from the radiator so freezing wouldn't crack the block overnight. I'll come back next Saturday if you want. Bring surveying equipment, help you map out where the terraces should go. No charge, just, he paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like pity, just seems like a shame to let good ambition die from lack of information. Ellen studied his face in the dim light, looking for condescension or ulterior motive, the things men usually carried when they offered to help women with machinery. What she found instead was something that looked like genuine interest, maybe even respect for someone attempting what everyone else had already decided was impossible. She nodded acceptance, and Graham smiled for the first time, an expression that transformed his face from weathered to warm and made Ellen remember, briefly and painfully, what it felt like to have someone look at her like she mattered for reasons beyond obligation. January gave way to February through a series of Saturdays that established a pattern. Graham would arrive at 9, carrying coffee in a thermos and equipment borrowed from the extension office, and they'd work until the cold or the failing light sent them inside. He taught her to run a transit level, to measure grade and calculate cut and fill, to think in cubic yards instead of shovelfuls. The terracing plan emerged slowly, a series of benches that would transform the Badlands from eroding gullies into stepped fields that caught runoff and held soil. The work was technical and demanding, but what surprised Ellen more was the conversation that happened between the teaching. Graham talked about his own life in the careful way of someone who'd learned that vulnerability required trust, and trust required time. He'd been married once, his wife dead 5 years from cancer that started in her breast and spread before doctors caught it. His son lived in Billings, worked for the power company, visited twice a year at Christmas and 4th of July. The loneliness in his voice when he talked about the empty house in Havre was so familiar that Ellen found herself responding with her own story, the abbreviated version that mentioned Jack's death, but not the nights she'd spent wondering if being alone forever was punishment for some failure she couldn't identify. By March, when the snow started to melt and the ground began its slow thaw toward workable, they'd mapped every foot of the 80 acres. The terrace plan called for 12 benches, each one running the contour of the land, each one designed to slow water enough that it soaked in instead of cutting deeper gullies. Graham estimated 200 hours of dozer work, maybe 250 if she hit bedrock or buried machinery from homesteaders who'd tried and failed a century ago. You'll need help with this. One person can run a dozer, but one person can't survey their own work, can't check grade while they're cutting, can't pull them out when they get stuck. His voice carried the authority of experience, someone who'd seen ambitious plans fail because pride prevented asking for assistance. I can come weekends through spring. After that, you're on your own. I've got county fair obligations, pasture walks, soil testing that can't wait. Ellen wanted to refuse, wanted to prove she could do this alone the way she'd done everything alone since Jack died. But the math was unforgiving. 250 hours of solo work meant mistakes she couldn't catch, delays she couldn't afford, risks that could destroy the dozer or worse. She agreed, and something in Graham's expression suggested he'd been expecting an argument and was pleased to not have one. The first cut happened on a Tuesday in late March. The ground just barely thawed enough to move, but still cold enough that the dozer's tracks left deep prints that would take weeks to disappear. Ellen started at the northwest corner, the highest point of the Badlands, where her grandfather's letter said he dug down 6 feet and found bentonite. Graham stood 50 yards downslope with the transit hand signals guiding her through the cut, telling her when to raise the blade or lower it, when to angle left or push straight. The work had a rhythm that consumed time differently than clocks measured it. Hours dissolved into passes, each one moving 6 yards of dirt from high ground to low, each one transforming erosion into flat bench. The dozer burned diesel at a rate that made Ellen wince when she calculated the cost: 3 gallons an hour at 70 cents per gallon, $2.10 for every 60 minutes of progress. But the alternative was handwork that would take years instead of months, was admitting that some tasks were too big for one person with limited resources. They broke for lunch at noon, sandwiches Ellen had made that morning and coffee from Graham's thermos that had gone lukewarm but still tasted better than the instant she made in her trailer. They sat on the ground near where she'd been cutting, and Graham pointed out what she'd accomplished: 400 feet of terrace that already showed how the work would transform the land. You're a natural at this. Some people fight the machine, try to force it. You're letting it do what it wants, just guiding it toward where you need it to go. That's the difference between someone who operates equipment and someone who partners with it. The compliment landed in a place Ellen hadn't known was empty, and she found herself looking away before Graham could see how much his words mattered. They finished lunch in comfortable silence, and when they returned to work the afternoon passed in a blur of diesel smoke and moving earth, of Graham's hand signals and the dozer's transmission whining in third gear, of incremental progress that didn't feel like much until you stepped back and saw that 400 feet had become 800. April brought visitors. Carter drove out on a Wednesday afternoon, parked his truck at the edge of the Badlands, and stood watching Ellen cut terrace number 3. She saw him from the corner of her eye but didn't stop, didn't acknowledge his presence beyond a brief wave that could have meant hello or go away depending on interpretation. When she finally shut down the dozer and climbed off to check her work, Carter was still standing there, hat pushed back on his head, expression somewhere between impressed and confused. You've moved more dirt in 3 weeks than Dad moved in 30 years. His voice carried no mockery, just observation presented as neutral fact. Carol said I should come check on you, make sure you weren't killing yourself out here, but it looks like you're doing fine. Better than fine, actually. Ellen grabbed her water jug from the dozer's toolbox and drank long enough to buy herself time to figure out what Carter wanted. Her brother wasn't social by nature, didn't make unnecessary trips, which meant this visit had purpose beyond checking on her welfare. She waited, and eventually Carter found whatever words he'd been rehearsing. I've been thinking about Dad's will, about why he gave you the Badlands and the dozer instead of splitting the ranch 4 ways, and I think maybe he knew something we didn't. That you'd do this, that you'd take the worst ground on the place and make something out of it. He paused, looking out across the terraces she'd already cut, the transformation visible even to someone who didn't understand grading or erosion control. I just wanted you to know that I think he was right. You're doing something none of us could do, and he stopped, the word catching somewhere between thought and speech, I'm proud of you. The admission cost him something. Ellen could see that in the way he wouldn't meet her eyes, in the way his hand gripped his hat brim too tight. Carter had spent his whole life being the oldest, the one who got the best land and the weight of expectation, and admitting his little sister was better at something fundamental must have felt like surrendering ground he'd never questioned owning. Thank you. Ellen's response came out quieter than she intended, and the two of them stood in silence that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't hostile either. Siblings separated by inheritance but connected by blood and history, and the specific gravity of watching their father's choices play out in ways none of them had anticipated. Carter left after a few more minutes of small talk about weather and wheat prices, and Ellen returned to the dozer feeling something she couldn't quite name. Validation, maybe, or just the basic human need to be seen for what she was actually doing instead of what people assumed. Wade showed up 2 weeks later with different energy entirely. He arrived in his new Silverado, music loud enough to hear from a quarter-mile away, and when he climbed out of the truck, his movements carried the aggressive confidence of someone who'd been drinking and thought alcohol made him clever instead of just loud. Ellen was greasing the dozer's track rollers when she saw him coming, and something in his walk made her set down the grease gun and stand up straight, made her aware that being alone on 80 acres with a brother who'd never liked her much was perhaps not the safest situation. "Look at you, playing in the dirt like a kid with a sandbox." Wade's voice had the false cheer of someone who thought they were being funny, who expected her to laugh along with mockery disguised as teasing. "Dad really screwed you, didn't he? Give the boys real land and give Ellen a toy to play with. That's some old-school sexism right there." Ellen wiped grease from her hands onto a rag that was already more grease than cloth, buying time while she calculated how this conversation would go and whether it would stay verbal. "I'm terracing 80 acres. That's not playing, that's land management. Something you might want to look into before you plant the same crop in the same field for the 20th straight year and wonder why your yields keep dropping." The observation hit exactly where she'd aimed it, and Wade's expression shifted from false cheer to actual anger in the space between heartbeats. His face flushed red, and he took 2 steps closer, close enough that Ellen could smell whiskey on his breath and see the broken capillaries in his nose that suggested drinking was becoming more habit than recreation. "You think you're smarter than me. You think because Dad gave you a dozer you're some kind of expert. You're 40 years old living in a trailer playing with dirt. I've got 520 acres of producing wheat, got a new truck, got a wife and a future. You've got nothing except what we let you keep out of charity." The words were meant to wound, and they did, landing in places Ellen had learned to protect but never quite succeeded in armoring completely. But underneath the hurt was anger, clean and pure. The kind that came from knowing that Wade's success was built on leverage he didn't understand and pride that wouldn't survive contact with changing markets. She met his eyes and held them, let the silence stretch until he looked away first, a small victory that cost nothing but made Wade's exit faster than his arrival. He climbed back into his truck and spun tires leaving, gravel pinging against the dozer's undercarriage. And Ellen stood in the settling dust, feeling something that might have been satisfaction, or might have just been exhaustion from carrying other people's opinions about what she should be doing with her inheritance. The discovery happened on a Saturday in early May, 3 weeks after Wade's visit and 2 weeks before Ellen would drill the well that would prove her father's letter accurate about water at 340 feet. She was doing maintenance on the dozer, checking the hydraulic system for leaks that had been leaving puddles under the machine overnight, when her wrench slipped and fell into the gap between the seat and the fuel tank. Cursing, she reached down into the space to retrieve it, her fingers finding not just the wrench but something else, something that felt like folded paper wedged deep in a crevice that hadn't been designed to hold anything. The envelope was smaller than the one her father had left with the lawyer, yellowed with age and sealed with the same red wax that bore her grandfather's signet ring. But the handwriting on the front wasn't her father's blocky script. It was older, more formal, the kind of penmanship they'd stopped teaching in schools decades ago. The envelope was addressed simply, "To whoever inherits this machine." Ellen sat in the dozer seat, suddenly aware that her hands were shaking as she broke the seal. The letter inside was dated March 1967, the year the dozer had been manufactured, and the signature at the bottom was her father's, but the writing above it told a story she'd never heard. I'm buying this bulldozer today with money I've saved for 10 years. $4,800 that could have gone toward land or equipment or paying down debt, but I'm spending it on this machine for a specific reason. Not because I need it. The ranch isn't big enough to justify owning a dozer, but because I know that whoever gets this will need it more than they'll need land. I have 4 children, 3 boys and a girl. The boys will inherit ranches because that's how things are done, how my father did it, how his father did it before him. But Ellen, my daughter, she's different. She's 10 years old right now, and already she understands this land better than her brothers ever will. She asks questions they never think to ask, sees problems they don't notice, works harder than boys twice her age. But the world won't let her ranch. Not the way it should. Not the way she deserves. So I'm buying this machine and I'm hiding this letter, and I'm making a plan that'll take another 10 years to execute. I'm going to give her the worst land on the place, the badlands that everyone thinks are worthless, and I'm going to give her this dozer to fix them with. And I'm going to pray that she's strong enough to turn disadvantage into advantage, that she'll prove what I already know but don't have the courage to say out loud. The boys will get their ranches and they'll probably lose them. They're good kids, but they don't have Ellen's discipline, her vision, her stubborn refusal to accept that something can't be done. They'll borrow and expand and bet on markets staying favorable, and when markets turn they'll lose everything because that's what happens to people who mistake inheritance for competence. Ellen will start with nothing and build everything. She'll do it alone because accepting help would mean someone could claim credit for her success. She'll sacrifice years to proving she's capable, and the world will call it stubbornness instead of strength. But she'll succeed in ways the boys never could, and maybe, if I'm lucky, she'll forgive me for being too much a coward to break tradition publicly while still trying to break it privately. This dozer cost me $4,800 in 1967. By the time Ellen inherits it, it'll be worth maybe $5,000. But what she builds with it will be worth millions, not in money but in proof that being underestimated is the beginning of greatness, not the end of possibility. If you're reading this and you're not Ellen, I failed. My courage failed, or I died before I could execute the plan, or something changed that I couldn't predict. But if you're Ellen, know this, I saw you. I saw everything you could be, and I built this whole plan around faith that you'd become exactly that. The Badlands aren't punishment. They're opportunity. The dozer isn't consolation. It's liberation. And the inheritance that looked like insult is actually the only gift that would force you to become who you already are, but the world won't let you be. Forgive me for the cowardice. But more than that, forgive me for being right about needing to hide this. Because if I'd given you everything openly, they would have taken it from you through lawsuits or social pressure or the 1,000 ways that men punish women who refuse to stay in assigned positions. This way, you take nothing. You build everything. And nobody can claim you didn't earn what you achieve. I love you, Ellen. I'm sorry I won't be brave enough to say it the way I should. But I love you enough to spend 10 years planning how to give you freedom disguised as disadvantage. Make me right. Make me proud. And when you succeed, know that I knew you would all along. Your father, Robert Merrick, March 1967. Ellen sat in the dozer's seat for an hour after reading the letter, not moving, barely breathing, feeling the accumulated anger of 7 months dissolve into something more complicated than she had words for. Her father had planned this. Not in the moment of making his will, not as some deathbed decision, but for 10 years before he died. He'd bought the dozer when she was 10 specifically, so she could inherit it at 40. He'd known she'd get the Badlands, known the brothers would get ranches, known exactly how it would look to everyone and exactly how it would actually work. The manipulation was massive and tender, the kind of thing that came from love filtered through cowardice, from knowing the right thing and lacking courage to do it openly. He'd been right that giving her land openly would have invited challenge, that the brothers or their wives or community pressure would have found ways to undermine or diminish or claim credit. This way, she built alone and nobody could take it from her. But he'd also been wrong to hide this letter for 30 years, wrong to let her spend months angry about inheritance that looked like dismissal when it was actually the most profound faith he could express. The anger and the gratitude existed simultaneously, both true and both inadequate, and Ellen found herself crying for the first time since her father's funeral, not from grief, but from the complicated relief of being seen by someone who died before she could thank them for the seeing. Graham noticed the change in her the following Saturday when he arrived to help with the terracing. She was different, more at peace with herself in ways that showed in how she moved, how she spoke, how she didn't deflect his compliments anymore. They were working terrace number 7 by then, halfway through the plan, and the transformation was becoming undeniable. Where erosion had cut gullies deep enough to swallow a cow, flat benches now caught runoff and held soil. Early grass was already sprouting on the oldest terraces, volunteer seed finding purchase in ground that had been too steep and unstable to support growth. "You want to talk about what changed?" Graham's question came during their lunch break, both of them sitting in the shade of the dozer where the spring sun couldn't quite reach. His voice carried concern but not pressure, leaving space for Ellen to decline the invitation if she chose. Ellen pulled the letter from her coat pocket, the envelope now resealed with tape because the wax had crumbled when she'd opened it. She handed it to Graham without preamble, watching his face as he read words her father had written 11 years before she'd inherited anything, watching understanding transform his expression from curious to something approaching awe. He planned it, all of it. The dozer, the badlands, the inheritance that looked like insult. He knew 10 years before he died exactly what he was doing and why. Graham read the letter twice before handing it back, and when he spoke his voice carried the weight of someone recognizing profound gesture while also seeing its flaws. That's extraordinary, and cowardly, and brilliant, and sad, all at the same time. Ellen folded the letter carefully and returned it to her pocket, this piece of paper that had transformed her understanding of everything that had happened since July. "I spent 7 months being angry at him for giving me scraps while the boys got ranches. And all that time he'd planned for me to have more than any of them, just had to do it in a way that looked like the opposite. I don't know whether to be grateful or furious." "You can be both." Graham's observation came gentle and certain. "He gave you something precious, but he wrapped it in humiliation and made you earn recognition he should have given freely. The fact that his plan worked doesn't mean it wasn't also cruel in how it worked. You're allowed to love him for the faith and hate him for the cowardice simultaneously." The validation that both emotions were justified loosened something in Ellen's chest, gave her permission to hold contradictions without having to resolve them into simple narrative. They sat in silence after that, two people who'd spent months building something neither fully understood, and Ellen felt the weight of her father's letter pressing against her chest pocket like second heartbeat, reminder that being seen mattered almost as much as being supported, and that sometimes the two things came together in ways that were complicated and painful and still somehow worth the complication. May brought warmth and the realization that Ellen's savings were disappearing faster than anticipated. The dozer was burning through diesel at 3 gallons per hour, and 200 hours of work meant 600 gallons at 70 cents each, $420 just for fuel. She'd spent another $300 on grease and filters and small parts that wore out faster than the manual predicted. The math was becoming uncomfortable, savings dropping from 12,700 to under 11,000, and she was barely half finished with the terracing. The bank would lend her money, she knew that. Carter had offered to co-sign for a line of credit in April, but taking that money meant accepting debt she wasn't sure she could service, meant betting on her father's letter being accurate about bentonite deposits that might not exist in quantities that mattered. Ellen had spent too many years watching Jack struggle with equipment loans to be comfortable owing money, had learned from his death that debt outlived the people who took it on and left widows with obligations they couldn't meet. She was working terrace number 9 on a Tuesday afternoon when the dozer's engine note changed, a slight miss that became a pronounced stumble and then died completely. Ellen sat in sudden silence, the kind that felt loud after hours of diesel roar, and tried the starter. Nothing happened. Not a click, not a turnover, just dead silence that suggested something fundamental had failed in a way that would be expensive to fix. Graham arrived an hour later, responding to a phone call Ellen had made from Carter's house, and his diagnosis was delivered with the gentle certainty of someone who'd seen this failure before and knew exactly what it meant. Injection pump. It's a Bosch unit, probably original to the machine, which means it's had 11 years to wear out. You can rebuild it for about $1,200 if you find someone who knows what they're doing, or replace it for $3,000 if you want new. $1,200 Ellen didn't have without dipping into savings she needed for seed and fence, and the well drilling she'd planned for June. $3,000 was impossible without a loan she'd sworn not to take. She sat on the dozer's track, head in her hands, doing arithmetic that didn't work no matter how she rearranged the numbers, and felt the weight of everyone's skepticism settling on her shoulders like snow that wouldn't melt. I can rebuild it. Graham's offer came quiet and certain. I've got the tools and the experience, did diesel mechanic work before I went back to school for the ag degree. Parts will cost about $400 if we order them from a supplier I know in Great Falls. Labor is free, but it'll take 3 weekends to get it done right. That puts you back in the seat by mid-June, which is tight but doable if the ground stays workable. Ellen looked up at him, this man who'd spent every Saturday since February teaching her things he could have charged for, who just offered 3 weekends of skilled labor without expecting payment, and felt something crack in the armor she'd been maintaining since Jack died. Why are you doing this? Why do you care if I finish terracing 80 acres of badlands that everybody says are worthless? Graham sat down beside her on the track, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the evening chill, and when he spoke his voice carried a weight that suggested he'd been waiting for this question, and had prepared an answer that was more honest than wise. Because watching you work reminds me that stubborn determination can still beat long odds. Because your father gave you an impossible task, and you're doing it anyway, and that matters in ways that go beyond acreage or yield. And because, he paused, and Ellen could feel him gathering courage for whatever came next, because I haven't felt this invested in someone else's success in 5 years, and that means something I'm not quite ready to name but can't keep pretending I don't feel. The admission hung between them in the fading light, and Ellen felt her careful control slipping, felt tears starting that she couldn't quite stop, because the loneliness of 3 years was suddenly too heavy to carry alone, and here was someone offering to help shoulder the weight. Graham's hand found hers, calluses matching calluses, and they sat in silence while the sun dropped below the horizon and turned the badlands into shadows that looked almost beautiful. I can't give you what you want. Ellen's words came out rough, scraped from a throat that felt too tight. I'm 40 years old and broken in ways I don't know how to fix. I work every day until I'm too tired to think because thinking means feeling and feeling hurts too much. You deserve someone whole, someone who has room for love instead of just survival. Graham's laugh was soft and entirely without humor. Ellen, I'm 54 years old and I haven't felt whole since my wife died. I wake up alone and go to bed alone, and fill the hours between with work that matters to other people but not to me. If broken is what we both are, maybe we could be broken together and see if that's better than being broken alone." They kissed then, tentative and awkward, two people who'd forgotten how intimacy worked and were relearning through touch what words couldn't quite convey. It lasted maybe 10 seconds before Ellen pulled away, overwhelmed by feelings she'd been suppressing for so long they felt foreign and dangerous. Graham let her go without resistance, but his hand stayed in hers, and when he spoke again his voice carried understanding that made the moment bearable. "I'm not asking for forever. I'm asking for the possibility of now. Help me fix your dozer. Let me teach you to drill a well. And maybe between the work we figure out if broken together is worth trying. No pressure, no expectations, just two people seeing if companionship beats loneliness." Ellen nodded, not quite trusting her voice, and they sat together as darkness settled completely, and the stars came out in quantities that only happened in places far from city lights. Somewhere in that darkness, in the space between terraces she'd finished and terraces she still needed to cut, Ellen felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the constriction that had been there since Jack's funeral. The injection pump rebuild happened across 3 weekends in late May, Graham working in Carter's machine shed, while Ellen assisted and learned. The Bosch unit came apart in pieces that looked too small to contain the power they generated, and Graham's hands moved through the disassembly with the confidence of someone who'd done this enough times that muscle memory replaced conscious thought. He explained what each component did, how fuel pressure and timing interacted, why tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch mattered when dealing with diesel combustion. They worked 10-hour days Saturday and Sunday, breaking only for lunch Ellen packed and coffee Graham brought, and the conversation that happened around the work shifted from professional to personal in increments neither of them quite acknowledged. Graham talked about his marriage, the good years before cancer and the hard years after, the specific loneliness of watching someone die slowly and being unable to stop it. Ellen told him about Jack, about the accident that happened so fast there wasn't time for goodbye, about the guilt of feeling relief mixed with grief, because being a widow was somehow easier than being a wife to someone whose back injury had made him bitter and distant. By the 3rd weekend the pump was reassembled and reinstalled, and when Ellen turned the key the dozer started on the first try, settling into an idle that was smoother than it had been in months. Graham stood back, wiping grease from his hands, and the satisfaction on his face was so pure that Ellen found herself smiling for the first time in weeks. "You're back in business. Should get another 10 years out of that pump if you maintain it right." He closed the toolbox and turned to face her, and Ellen saw him gathering courage for something he'd apparently been planning. "There's a dance in Havre next Saturday night. VFW Hall, country band, nothing fancy. Would you go with me? Not as a thank you for the pump, just because I'd like to spend an evening with you doing something that isn't work." The invitation terrified her in ways that terracing 80 acres hadn't, because machinery was predictable and people weren't, because going to a dance meant being seen as a couple in a town small enough that everyone would notice and talk. But Graham was looking at her with hope that seemed fragile enough to break with refusal, and Ellen found herself nodding agreement before fear could construct adequate justification for declining. They went to the dance, and it was exactly as awkward as Ellen feared and more tender than she'd hoped. Graham was a careful dancer, compensating for his limp with timing that turned limitation into style, and holding him was strange and familiar, and made Ellen remember that her body was capable of things beyond labor. They stayed until 11, later than Ellen had been awake in months, and when Graham drove her home, the conversation had the easy flow of people who'd stopped performing and started just being. He walked her to the trailer door, and the kiss goodnight lasted longer than the first one had, carried weight that suggested this was becoming something neither of them had quite planned, but both were willing to explore. Graham pulled back first, his hand gentle against her cheek, and his voice when he spoke was rough with emotion he wasn't quite hiding. "I'm going to say something that might scare you off, but I'd rather lose you to honesty than keep you through omission. I care about you, Ellen. More than professionally, more than friendship. I'm 54 years old and I don't have time to be patient about feelings this strong. So I'm asking directly, is there any possibility this could become something real, or am I hoping for something you can't give?" Ellen stood in the dark with this man's hand on her face and felt the question demanding an answer she didn't know if she could provide. The truth was complicated, wrapped up in fear and grief, and the bone-deep exhaustion of fighting alone for so long that accepting help felt like surrendering. But Graham was offering something she'd stopped believing was possible, partnership that didn't require her to be less than she was, companionship that enhanced instead of diminished. "Ask me again in 5 years." The words came out before she'd fully thought them through, and Graham's face shifted from hope to confusion to something that might have been hurt. Ellen rushed to explain before he could misunderstand completely. "I need to finish what I started. Get the terracing done, find out if there's really bentonite under this ground, prove to myself that I can build something from nothing. If I start a relationship now, I'll always wonder if I succeeded because of my work or because you helped me. And I need it to be my work, Graham. I need to know I can do this alone before I can accept not being alone." The explanation wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and Graham processed it in silence that stretched long enough to make Ellen worry she just destroyed something that could have been good. When he finally spoke, his voice carried acceptance that sounded like love, the kind that prioritized someone else's needs over its own wants. 5 years. 1983. I'll ask you again then, and if the answer is still wait, I'll know this isn't going to happen and I can move on. But Ellen, he pulled her close enough that she could feel his breath against her hair. 5 years is a long time to hold hope. Don't make me wait if you already know the answer is no. Ellen held him and felt the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, and wished she could give him certainty instead of postponement. But the terracing was half finished, and the well needed drilling and her father's letters promised bentonite deposits she hadn't verified, and all of it demanded focus. She couldn't split between building a ranch and building a relationship. She kissed him once more, trying to put into the contact what words couldn't quite convey, then stepped back and watched him drive away into darkness that felt lonelier than it had before he'd offered to make it less so. June came hot and dry, and Ellen returned to the terracing with renewed focus that bordered on obsession. The dozer ran 12-hour days, cutting benches that transformed the Badlands into something approaching agricultural land, and by the end of the month terrace number 12 was complete. She stood at the highest point of the 80 acres and looked down at what she'd accomplished. Saw water flowing along benches instead of cutting gullies, saw grass establishing on slopes that had been bare dirt 4 months earlier. The transformation was undeniable and insufficient. She had terraced land but no water beyond what rain provided, had stopped erosion but not created the irrigation her father's letter promised was possible. The well needed to be drilled, 340 feet down through rock and clay, and the cost of drilling was $2,200 according to the quote she'd received from Shelby Drilling Company. Ellen's savings stood at $9,400, enough to drill the well and have $7,000 left for seed and fence, and the geological survey she'd need if bentonite actually existed. The math was tight enough to make breathing difficult, but every day she waited was a day wasted. Was summer passing without the crops that could generate revenue to rebuild what terracing had depleted? She called Shelby Drilling on the first Monday in July and scheduled them for the following week. The crew arrived on Tuesday with a truck-mounted rig that looked older than the dozer, and the driller was a man in his 60s named Curtis who'd been punching holes in Montana since before Ellen was born. He studied her father's letter about water at 340 feet and nodded like it confirmed something he already suspected. Robert Merrick was a smart man, smarter than people gave him credit for. He understood this ground in ways most folks don't, knew where the old river channels ran underground before the glaciers pushed them around. If he said water at 340, I'd bet my rig he was within 10 feet either direction. The drilling took 3 days, the rig's diesel hammer pounding through layers of rock and clay that came up in the cuttings wet and gray and promising. At 338 feet, Curtis pulled the bit and rigged a test pump, and when he fired it up, water flowed clear and cold. 5 gallons per minute that meant Ellen's 80 acres could support irrigation that would transform possibility into production. The joy of finding water was complicated by the discovery that happened at 260 feet, when Curtis had pulled up cuttings that were different from everything above them. The clay was thicker, grayer, stuck to itself in ways that made it hard to wash off the bit, and when Ellen rubbed it between her fingers it felt slick and dense, like nothing she'd encountered before. "That's bentonite," Curtis said, examining the sample with professional interest. "Good quality too from the feel of it. You've got maybe 70, 80 feet of it between 260 and 340. That's a lot of clay, Ellen. A whole lot. Worth money if you ever wanted to lease the mineral rights." Ellen stood holding gray clay that represented everything her father and grandfather had promised. Proof that the Badlands weren't worthless, but were actually sitting on top of wealth most people would never recognize. The vindication should have felt sweeter, but all she could think about was that she'd spent $2,200 to drill a well and found evidence of deposits that could be worth tens of thousands annually, and she had no idea how to convert one into the other. She paid Curtis his fee and watched the drilling rig drive away, then sat on the ground near the new well with gray clay drying on her hands and both of her father's letters in her lap. The terracing was finished. The water was proven. The bentonite was real. Everything he'd promised was true. Everything he'd planned for 10 years had worked exactly as he designed it, and she'd accomplished in 6 months what everyone had said was impossible. But Graham was gone, accepting her request for 5 years of waiting, and Ellen was alone on 80 acres that were starting to look like success, but still felt like isolation. The sun dropped toward the horizon, turning the terraces into shadows and highlights, and somewhere in the beauty of what she'd built, Ellen wondered if proving she could do it alone meant she'd condemned herself to staying that way, if her father's gift of forced independence had been liberation, or just another cage with bigger walls and better views. The Geological Survey Company out of Billings quoted $3,200 to core sample the 80 acres and verify bentonite deposits in quantities sufficient for commercial leasing. Ellen had $7,400 remaining after the well drilling, which meant paying for the survey would leave her with $4,200 for seed, fence, and the inevitable equipment repairs that came with running machinery held together by stubbornness and prayer. The math was possible but unforgiving, the kind that required every decision to be correct and every assumption to prove accurate. She signed the contract in late July, and the survey crew arrived the first week of August with a truck-mounted drill rig smaller than the one Curtis had used for the water well. They punched 8 holes across the Badlands, each one going down 300 feet, pulling core samples that came up in sections showing layers of rock and clay, and the gray bentonite her grandfather had found in 1952. The lead geologist was a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, maybe 35, who handled core samples with the reverence most people reserved for newborns and spoke about clay mineralogy with an enthusiasm that made technical subjects sound like poetry. "You've got excellent quality sodium bentonite here, consistent layer averaging 70 to 80 feet thick across the entire parcel. Dr. Chen spread the core samples on a folding table near Ellen's trailer, pointing out variations in color and texture that meant something to trained eyes. Conservative estimate, you're looking at 240,000 tons of recoverable material. At current market rates, $40 per ton wholesale. That's $9.6 million worth of bentonite sitting underground that most people think is worthless. The number was too large to process immediately, the kind of wealth that existed in theory but felt impossible in practice. Ellen did the arithmetic 3 different ways, trying to find the error that would bring the figure back down to something believable. But Dr. Chen's report was methodical and conservative, presenting data that supported conclusions Ellen's family had been sitting on for 3 generations without knowing. The leasing structure Dr. Chen recommended was straightforward. Rather than selling the mineral rights outright, Ellen could lease them to extraction companies for royalties based on tonnage removed. Industry standard was 8 to 12% of wholesale value, which meant every ton pulled from the ground would generate $3 to $5 in passive income. A modest operation extracting 10,000 tons annually would produce 40,000 in royalties, year after year, for as long as the bentonite lasted. Your father was a smart man. Dr. Chen rolled up the geological maps and secured them with rubber bands that had gone brittle in the heat. Most people would have strip mined this in the 50s when bentonite prices spiked for Korean War drilling applications. But he preserved it, which means you have an asset that'll generate income for 40, maybe 50 years if you manage it right. That's generational wealth, Ms. Merrick. That's the kind of thing families build legacies on. Ellen paid the survey fee and received documentation thick enough to require a 3-ring binder, technical data, and mineral assays and legal descriptions that transformed gut feeling into marketable fact. She sat in her trailer that evening with the binder open on the kitchen table, staring at numbers that promised security she'd never imagined possible, and felt nothing except a hollow awareness that having wealth and having purpose were different things entirely. The phone call to Graham happened before she'd fully decided to make it, her hand moving through the motions while her mind was still processing whether reaching out after 6 weeks of silence was fair to either of them. He answered on the 3rd ring, voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd been hoping for contact, but had learned not to expect it. I found it, the bentonite. 240,000 tons, 8% royalty would be 32,000 a year. Everything my father promised was true. Ellen's words came out in a rush, fact stacking on fact because technical information was safer than emotional confession. I wanted you to know. You helped me get here, and it seemed wrong to not tell you. Graham's silence on the other end lasted long enough that Ellen wondered if the connection had dropped, but then she heard him exhale, the sound carrying relief and something else she couldn't quite identify. I'm happy for you, Ellen, truly. You worked for this, earned it, and I'm glad your father was right about what was under that ground. His pause felt weighted. Does this change anything about the 5 years about us? The question hung between them across telephone lines that connected Haver to Ellen's trailer, and she wished she could give him the answer he wanted instead of the truth she had to offer. I don't know yet. I need to figure out what leasing the mineral rights means. Need to plant the terraces and see if they'll actually produce crops. Need to know that this success is real before I can think about what comes after. Ask me again in 5 years. Please. That's all I can give you right now. Graham's acceptance came quiet and resigned. 1983. I'll mark it on my calendar. And Ellen, his voice shifted into something more direct, more honestly hurt than she'd heard before. I hope whatever you're building is worth what you're sacrificing to build it. Because from where I'm standing, you're choosing loneliness over companionship and calling it independence. That's your right, but don't pretend it's not a choice. The call ended with goodbyes that felt more final than either of them acknowledged, and Ellen sat in silence broken only by the propane heater's hiss, and the awareness that she just prioritized land over love for the second time in 6 months. The decision should have felt empowering, proof that she could make hard choices and live with consequences. Instead, it felt like confirmation that some part of her was fundamentally broken, that the piece of her capable of accepting affection had died with Jack and wouldn't resurrect no matter how much success she accumulated. September brought Carter with news that arrived in his truck on a Tuesday afternoon, his expression carrying the specific gravity of someone delivering information they wished they didn't have to share. Wade's in trouble. Real trouble, not just the regular kind. He borrowed $85,000 against his ranch back in June, variable rate note that made sense at 10%, but he didn't read the terms close enough. Rate adjusted to 14% last week, and his payment jumped from $700 a month to nearly $1,200. He can't make it, Ellen. Even with decent wheat prices, he's underwater by $2,000 a month. Ellen gestured Carter inside the trailer, this space that had become her command center for planning operations that no longer fit the definition of small scale. The geological survey binder sat on the table alongside crop plans and irrigation schedules, evidence of transformation from struggling widow to landowner, with assets worth discussing. She poured coffee neither of them would drink and waited for Carter to explain why Wade's financial crisis required her attention. He came to me first, asking to borrow $30,000 to restructure the debt. I don't have it. The mortgage Dad left me is eating everything I make, and Carol's working double shifts just to keep us current. Wade's talking about going to Boone next, but Boone's barely hanging on himself. That leaves you. And I know it's not fair to ask, but Wade's my brother and I can't watch him lose everything without trying. The request landed in territory Ellen had been dreading since the geological survey confirmed she had resources other people would need. Wade had been cruel at the terracing site, had questioned her competence and dismissed her work, had represented everything about family that prioritized tradition over fairness. But he was also Carter's brother, was human and failing, and Ellen's success gave her the power to help in ways that complicated the satisfaction of watching him struggle. What happens if I give him $30,000? Does that fix the problem or just delay it? Ellen's question came from experience watching Jack borrow and reborrow, seeing how debt had a way of metastasizing until the original problem became terminal. Wade's not going to change how he operates. He'll take the money, restructure, and then leverage himself again as soon as wheat prices make him feel rich. Carter nodded, acknowledging truth he didn't want to admit. You're probably right. But Ellen, he's family. And yeah, he's been a bastard to you, I know that. But letting him fail without trying to help, that's something we'd both have to live with. I'm not saying you owe him anything. I'm saying maybe we owe ourselves the knowledge that we tried. Ellen spent 3 days considering the request, running scenarios that all ended with Wade losing the ranch, eventually regardless of whether she helped now or let foreclosure happen sooner. The bentonite royalties wouldn't start flowing until she signed a lease agreement, and the companies she'd contacted were still conducting due diligence that would take months. Her available cash was $4,200, nowhere near the $30,000 Wade needed, which meant helping him would require taking a loan against mineral rights she didn't yet have income from. The decision crystallized on Friday evening, not from calculation but from exhausted recognition that some choices came down to who you wanted to be rather than what made strategic sense. She called Carter and told him no, she wouldn't lend Wade money that would only postpone inevitable failure. The relief in Carter's voice suggested he'd been expecting exactly that answer and was grateful to not have to argue against his own request. Wade showed up at Ellen's trailer the following Tuesday, sober but desperate, and the conversation that followed had the rhythm of a man drowning and bargaining for lifelines. He'd brought documentation showing his debt structure, his crop yields, his operating costs, laying out numbers that proved he wasn't exaggerating the crisis. The math was brutal and honest, and Ellen found herself almost respecting Wade's willingness to be vulnerable, even though vulnerability came too late to matter. "I know I've been terrible to you," mocking the terracing, calling it playing in a sandbox, acting like you didn't deserve respect. Wade's hands shook slightly as he gathered his papers, the tremor of someone who'd been drinking to manage stress and was currently between drinks. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry, and I'm asking anyway because I don't have anyone else to ask. 30,000 lets me restructure at fixed rate, gives me breathing room to survive until wheat prices recover. I'll pay you back, I swear it, with interest if you want." Ellen studied her brother across the kitchen table that had witnessed every important decision of her adult life, and saw not the cruel man from the terracing site, but something more complicated. Someone who'd inherited advantage and squandered it through choices that seemed smart, until markets shifted and exposed leverage as the trap it always was. She wanted to feel satisfaction in his failure, wanted the vindication of watching someone who dismissed her now begging for help. What she felt instead was tired sympathy for how little distance separated Wade's choices from ones she might have made if circumstances had been different. "I can't help you. Can't. I don't have 30,000 liquid, and even if I did, giving it to you doesn't solve the fundamental problem. You're farming the same way Dad farmed, the same way Grandpa farmed, and that worked when land was cheap and inputs were simple. But the economics have changed, Wade. Debt and scale were the right bet for 20 years, and now they're not. Restructuring your loan just delays the day you figure that out." Wade's face went through denial and anger before landing on something that looked like acceptance, the specific resignation of someone who'd known the answer before asking, but had needed to hear it confirmed. He stood to leave, gathering papers that documented failure he'd have to face alone, and paused at the door with words that came out more honest than Ellen had heard from him in years. "You were smarter than all of us. Dad saw it, gave you the worst land, and you made it worth more than everything the rest of us inherited. I don't know if that makes him wise or cruel, but I know you earned what you got and I'm losing what I was given. That's not your fault. It's mine." The admission didn't heal years of dismissal, but it acknowledged reality in ways that mattered, and Ellen watched Wade drive away feeling something that wasn't quite forgiveness but was closer to understanding. 6 weeks later, Carter called to say Wade's ranch had been posted for foreclosure, sale scheduled for early December, and that Denise had filed for divorce before the auction could finalize. The winter of 1978 into 1979 brought cold that tested infrastructure and revealed weaknesses in systems Ellen had thought were solid. The irrigation pipes she'd installed in October froze and burst during a January cold snap that pushed temperatures to 30 below for 5 consecutive nights, and the repair cost $800 she'd budgeted for spring seed. The dozer's hydraulic lines developed leaks that required replacement, another 600 in parts, and 3 weekends of work in Carter's unheated machine shed. Her hands so cold that holding wrenches became an exercise in controlled pain. The terraced acres that had looked so promising in summer sat under snow that wouldn't melt until April, and Ellen spent the winter months planning crops she wouldn't plant for another 3 months, calculating inputs and yields and margins that assumed weather would cooperate and markets would hold, and nothing catastrophic would happen. The planning was necessary and insufficient. Spreadsheets that created illusion of control over variables that respected no amount of preparation. Graham called on Ellen's 41st birthday in November, the first contact since their August conversation about bentonite deposits and postponed relationships. His voice carried the careful distance of someone who'd accepted boundaries but still cared enough to acknowledge occasions that mattered. "Happy birthday. I won't keep you. Just wanted you to know I was thinking about you and hoping the year's been good despite everything." The call lasted 4 minutes, Polite conversation about weather and crop plans and the extension service position Graham had been offered in Great Falls that would mean leaving Havre if he accepted. Ellen wanted to ask him to stay, wanted to admit that his absence had created a hole she filled with work that didn't actually satisfy the need he'd been meeting. What she said instead was congratulations on the opportunity and good luck with the decision. Words that maintained the distance she'd insisted on while making that distance feel more permanent than intended. After hanging up, Ellen sat in her trailer with a grocery store cupcake and a single candle, 41 years old and alone on her birthday, the way she'd been alone for every significant moment since Jack died. The bentonite lease agreement sat unsigned on her table, companies offering terms that ranged from adequate to generous, all of them requiring decisions she kept postponing because signing meant admitting this was real, that she'd actually built something worth leasing. Wade's auction happened the second Tuesday in December, bitter cold morning that kept the crowd smaller than foreclosure sales typically drew. Ellen attended but stayed at the back, bearing witness without participating, watching as 520 acres that had been Wade's inheritance sold in parcels that generated enough to cover what the bank was owed, but left Wade with nothing except debt to Denise's divorce lawyer. Carter bought one 40-acre parcel at market rate, the only family member with resources to reclaim even a piece of what had been lost, and the rest went to farmers from surrounding counties who saw opportunity in another man's failure. Wade was present for the sale, standing near his truck in a coat too thin for the weather, watching strangers bid on ground he'd worked for 6 years and lost through leverage that had seemed smart until interest rates proved otherwise. Ellen approached him after the auction ended, compelled by something she couldn't quite name, obligation or sympathy, or just the need to acknowledge shared history before Wade disappeared into whatever life waited after losing everything. "Where will you go?" Her question came without preamble, direct enough to bypass small talk neither of them had patience for. "Denise's brother owns a construction company in Missoula. He's offering me work, laborer wage, but it's something." Wade's voice carried exhaustion that went beyond physical tired, the specific depletion of someone who'd spent months fighting battles they knew they'd lose. "The divorce will be final in March, and after that I don't know. Start over, I guess. Figure out what a 46-year-old failed rancher does when ranching is all he knows." Ellen wanted to offer comfort, some reassurance that failure wasn't permanent and that rebuilding was possible. But she'd never failed at anything that mattered, had gone from inheritance everyone dismissed to success that surprised everyone including herself, and platitudes from someone who'd won rang hollow when delivered to someone who'd lost. What she offered instead was honesty stripped of comfort but at least containing truth. "You're not a failed rancher. You're someone who made reasonable bets that didn't work out. The difference matters even if it doesn't feel like it now." Ellen pulled an envelope from her coat pocket, something she'd prepared the night before during hours she should have spent sleeping. "There's $2,000 in here. Not a loan, a gift. Use it for whatever you need in Missoula, first month's rent or tools or just breathing room while you figure out what's next." Wade stared at the envelope like it might contain something dangerous, his expression cycling through suspicion and confusion before landing on something that looked like the edge of tears he was too proud to shed. "Why would you help me after everything I said, everything I did? I don't deserve your charity." "This isn't charity. It's what family does when they have resources and someone needs help. You were cruel, yeah, but cruelty that comes from fear of your own failure I can forgive. Take the money, Wade. Let it be the thing you remember when you think about how this ended." Ellen pressed the envelope into his hands and walked away before he could refuse or thank her, before the moment could become more complicated than the simple transaction of transferring wealth from someone who had it to someone who needed it. She drove home through December cold that made the truck's heater irrelevant, and somewhere in the frozen miles between the auction site and her trailer, Ellen felt something shift in her understanding of what success meant. She'd built wealth from Badlands, had proven skeptics wrong and validated her father's faith, had accomplished everything inheritance was supposed to enable. But Wade's departure represented family fracturing in ways wealth couldn't repair, and the $2,000 she'd given him felt simultaneously generous and insufficient, a gesture that acknowledged connection while doing nothing to restore what foreclosure had destroyed. Spring of 1979 brought Graham back into Ellen's orbit through circumstances neither of them had engineered. The extension service position in Great Falls had fallen through, funding cut by state budget constraints, and Graham had stayed in Havre managing programs he'd been running for a decade. He appeared at Ellen's 80 acres on a Saturday in March, ostensibly conducting a county survey of irrigation systems for a report he was compiling, but his presence felt less like official business and more like excuse to see how she was managing. The terraces had survived winter without major erosion, and the irrigation system Ellen had repaired was ready for the growing season that would finally test whether transformed Badlands could actually produce crops. Graham walked the entire 80 acres with her, asking technical questions about soil amendments and crop selection, offering advice that came from expertise but felt weighted with the subtext of someone who still cared and was trying to help without overstepping boundaries she'd established. They stood at the highest point of the property, looking down at terraces that stepped toward the county road in precise increments, and Graham spoke with the careful honesty of someone who'd been holding words too long and had decided release was worth the risk. "I tried to stop thinking about you. Dated a woman from Havre for 4 months. Nice person, compatible interests. Someone who actually wanted a relationship instead of asking me to wait 5 years. And the whole time I was with her, I was comparing her to you and finding her lacking, which wasn't fair to either of us, so I ended it." Graham turned to face Ellen directly, his expression carrying resignation. "I'm telling you this not to pressure you or make you feel guilty, but because I need you to understand that waiting isn't passive for me. It costs something real, and I need to know that cost might eventually mean something." Ellen felt the weight of his confession settling on her shoulders, adding to the accumulation of choices and consequences she'd been carrying since her father's will-divided inheritance in ways that forced her to build alone. She'd asked Graham to wait until 1983, had insisted she needed to prove herself without the complication of relationship, and he'd accepted terms that were fundamentally unfair and was still somehow managing to be patient. The least she owed him was honesty about whether patience would ever be rewarded. "I think about you more than I should. When something good happens, you're the first person I want to tell. When I'm struggling, I imagine what advice you'd give. You're in my head, Graham, and that terrifies me because the last person who mattered that much died and left me so broken I'm not sure I ever properly healed." Ellen's voice caught on words she'd never spoken aloud, admission of damage she'd been pretending didn't exist. "I'm asking you to wait because I don't know how to do this, how to be someone's partner when I barely know how to be a functional human beyond work. But I'm asking, not telling. If you need to move on, I'll understand. I'll hate it, but I'll understand." Graham reached for her hand, the gesture tentative and careful, and when Ellen didn't pull away, he interlaced their fingers with the intimacy of someone claiming connection they'd been denied too long. "I don't want to move on. I want to wait, and I want the waiting to end with us together. But Ellen," he squeezed her hand gently, "I'm 57 years old. I've got maybe 20 good years left if I'm lucky. Spending 4 of them waiting for you to be ready means spending 20% of my remaining life in limbo. So I need something from you. Not commitment, not promises you can't keep, just honesty about whether this is going somewhere or if I'm hoping for something that'll never happen." The question deserved an answer she didn't fully have, But Ellen offered what she could, partial truth that was at least genuine even if incomplete. I want this to go somewhere. I'm just terrified that somewhere means losing myself the way I lost myself in my marriage to Jack, becoming someone's wife instead of someone who happens to be married. Give me until 1983. Let me get the bentonite lease operational. Let me prove these terraces can produce. Let me know I'm building this for me and not just filling time until someone rescues me. Then ask me again, and I promise I'll have a real answer. They kissed there on the highest terrace. Spring wind cold enough to sting but not cold enough to drive them apart. And the contact carried weight of two people trying to bridge distance neither of them had fully chosen. Graham left an hour later with assurances that he'd continue helping when asked and wouldn't pressure for more than Ellen could give. And she watched his truck disappear down the county road, feeling something that wasn't quite hope, but was at least the possibility of hope deferred. The bentonite lease agreement Ellen finally signed in April 1979 was with Halliburton Energy Services, a subsidiary needing high-quality drilling mud for oil and gas operations that were expanding across the western states. The terms were 8% royalty on wholesale value, minimum extraction of 8,000 tons annually, 20-year lease with options to renew. The signing happened in a lawyer's office in Shelby, Ellen's hand shaking slightly as she wrote her name on documents that would generate $25,600 in the first year alone. Passive income that required nothing from her, except allowing companies to extract clay from depths her crops would never reach. The first royalty check arrived in November 1979, drawn on a Houston bank for $21,300, payment for the initial extraction phase that had pulled 670 tons during setup and testing. Ellen deposited it in the account at First Security Bank that had held her dwindling savings, and watching the balance jump from $3,800 to $25,100 felt simultaneously validating and surreal, wealth appearing not from labor, but from geological accidents her grandfather had discovered and her father had preserved. She used $15,000 to pay off the outstanding balance on Carter's mortgage, the debt their father had hidden, and that Carter had been servicing at rates that consumed every spare dollar his operation generated. The gesture was anonymous, arranged through the bank as early payoff from an unnamed source, and Ellen never told Carter the money came from her. But 2 weeks later he appeared at her trailer with Carol, both of them confused and grateful, and trying to figure out who would have cleared debt they'd assumed they'd carry, until selling became the only option. Someone paid off our mortgage. $38,000 just gone, and the bank won't say who. Carter's bewilderment was genuine and touching, someone so unused to good fortune that receiving it felt suspicious. I've been trying to figure out who we know with that kind of money and reason to help, and I keep coming back to you. But that doesn't make sense, because why would you help us after Dad gave us the good land and you the scraps? Ellen met his eyes and held them, letting silence answer what words would make complicated. Carter's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to something that looked like the beginning of tears, and Carol made a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh, the emotional release of people who'd been holding tension so long that its absence felt disorienting. You didn't have to do that. We would have managed somehow. Carter's voice broke on the words, and he didn't bother wiping at tears that were flowing freely now, masculine stoicism, abandoned in the face of generosity that demanded acknowledgement. Why, Ellen? After everything, why help us? Because you were kind when kindness cost you something. Because Carol worked night shifts trying to save a ranch that wasn't her failure. And because family is supposed to mean we help each other when we can, not just when it's convenient. Ellen's own eyes were burning now, emotions she'd been suppressing for months finding release in this moment of connection with the brother who tried to help when everyone else had dismissed her. The money isn't a loan. It's what I should have gotten in inheritance if Dad had been fair, and since he wasn't, I'm correcting it the way I can." Carol crossed the small space of the trailer and pulled Ellen into a hug that lasted long enough to feel like forgiveness for years of family dysfunction neither of them had caused. And when they finally separated, both women were crying in the way that felt cleansing instead of sad. Carter gripped Ellen's hand, unable to speak through emotion that had overwhelmed his ability to form words, and the three of them stood in the cramped trailer that had become command center for transformation from dismissed daughter to family benefactor. After they left, Ellen sat at her kitchen table feeling something unfamiliar and precious, the specific warmth of having resources that enabled helping people she cared about in ways that actually mattered. The bentonite lease would generate $25,000 annually for 20 years minimum, money that exceeded anything her father's ranch had ever produced in a single season. And the power that came with wealth was the ability to reshape circumstances for people drowning in situations they couldn't escape alone. December brought news of Boone through Carter's phone call, words delivered with the careful distance of someone reporting facts they wished were different. Boone's in the hospital in Wyoming. Tried to kill himself, pills and whiskey, but his wife found him in time. He's stable now, but Ellen, Carter's voice carried weight that suggested this was about more than just medical crisis. He's broke and broken, and I think losing the ranch destroyed something in him we can't fix. Ellen drove to Wyoming the following day, 8 hours through winter weather that made the trip longer and more dangerous than smart planning would have allowed. The hospital in Sheridan was small and overwhelmed, and Boone's room was at the end of a hallway that smelled like disinfectant, and the particular despair that accumulated in places where people came to confront mortality. He looked older than 44, his face gray and hollow, and when he saw Ellen standing in the doorway, something that might have been shame or might have been relief flickered across his expression. "You came." His voice was rough from the tube they'd used to pump his stomach, and when he tried to sit up straighter, pain made him wince and settle back against pillows that had gone flat from too much use. "I figured you'd hear I'd done something stupid and feel satisfied. Poetic justice, the brother who mocked you trying to check out early." Ellen pulled a chair close to the bed and sat, studying her youngest brother with the clinical detachment of someone assessing damage they hadn't caused but might be able to address. "I'm not satisfied, Boone. I'm sad and angry and trying to figure out what help looks like when someone's given up." Boone's laugh came out bitter and broken. "Help looks like a time machine that lets me go back to 1977 and listen when you tried to warn us about debt. Help looks like Dad splitting things fair instead of traditional. Help looks like anything except what I've got now, which is nothing except bills I can't pay and a wife who's staying out of obligation instead of love." The despair was real and earned, someone who'd lost not just wealth but identity, purpose, the thing that connected him to land and family and generational continuity. Ellen understood that loss in ways Boone probably didn't realize, had felt similar dissolution when Jack died, and she'd had to rebuild selfhood from component parts that no longer fit the structures they'd inhabited. What she'd learned was that reconstruction was possible, but required seeing the loss as ending rather than erasure, that who you became after catastrophe didn't have to resemble who you'd been before. "I can't fix what you've lost. Nobody can, but I can offer you something different if you're willing to hear it." Ellen waited until Boone met her eyes, until she had his attention focused beyond his own misery. "I need a foreman for the 80 acres. Someone who understands farming and equipment, who can manage irrigation and crop rotation while I handle the business side. It pays $30,000 a year plus housing. You'd be working for your little sister, which might be hard on your pride, but the work is real and the money is stable. Come spring if you want it." Boone stared at her like she'd spoken a language he didn't quite understand, charity or cruelty or some combination. He couldn't parse through the medication and exhaustion. Why would you offer me anything after I called you worthless, after I bet against you succeeding? Because you're my brother and you're hurting and I have resources to help. It's that simple, Boone. No strings, no conditions except that you actually want to live and are willing to work. Say yes or say no, but don't say no because you think you don't deserve help. Nobody deserves the hand they're dealt. We just play it the best we can. The answer didn't come immediately, but 3 weeks later Carter called to say Boone had been released from the hospital and was asking for Ellen's phone number, that he wanted to discuss the foreman position if the offer was still available. They talked for an hour, Boone's voice still carrying exhaustion but also something that might have been cautious hope. And by the time the call ended, Ellen had hired her brother to manage operations she'd built from land everyone had considered worthless. The winter of 1980 into 1981 felt like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. Economic forces gathering momentum that would eventually topple structures people had thought were permanent. Interest rates that had been climbing steadily through the late 70s hit 15% in December and showed no signs of stopping. Grain prices that had sustained operations through expensive credit started falling as global markets shifted, and the combination meant farmers across Montana were suddenly discovering that debt they'd thought was manageable had become terminal. Carter called in January to report that 3 neighboring ranches had posted foreclosure notices, good operators who'd made reasonable decisions that stopped being reasonable when variables changed faster than adaptation allowed. Graham stopped by in February to say the Extension Service was fielding calls from farmers asking about bankruptcy procedures and debt restructuring, that the crisis everyone had been pretending was temporary was starting to look structural and permanent. Ellen sat in her trailer with bentonite royalty statements showing income that exceeded what most ranchers grossed in good years, and felt the specific guilt of having succeeded while people around her failed, through no fault beyond trusting that the rules they'd learned would continue applying. The 80 acres were producing now, alfalfa and small grains that generated another $15,000 annually, and between crops and royalties, she was clearing $40,000 a year, with savings climbing toward amounts that should have felt like victory, but mostly felt like isolation from a community that was drowning while she floated. Graham appeared at her door on a Friday evening in late March 1981, his expression carrying concern that went beyond professional courtesy. "We need to talk about something I've been avoiding because it's not my business, but I care about you too much to stay silent." His voice was gentle but firm, the tone of someone delivering news they'd rather not share. "You're succeeding while everyone around you is failing, and that's creating distance between you and people who used to be your community. Some of that is jealousy, yeah, but some of it is genuine confusion about how you're building wealth when they're losing everything. People are starting to talk, Ellen, starting to wonder if your success is somehow connected to their failure." The accusation was absurd and painful, the specific violence of community turning on someone who'd violated unspoken rules about staying in assigned positions. Ellen had been the widow with the worthless badlands, and transforming into the woman with passive income and expanding operations made people uncomfortable in ways that manifested as suspicion. She wanted to be angry at the unfairness, wanted to demand recognition for work that had been legitimately hard and success that had been honestly earned. What she felt instead was tired understanding that some people would always find reasons to diminish achievement that made their own situations look like failures of effort rather than circumstance. What do they want from me? To fail so they feel better about failing, to give away what I've built so everyone ends up equally poor. Ellen's frustration came through sharper than intended, exhaustion and isolation combining into edge she hadn't meant to direct at Graham. I didn't cause the crisis. I didn't set interest rates or crash grain prices. I just worked land people thought was worthless and found value nobody else saw. That's not crime, it's farming. Graham moved closer, his hand finding hers with the familiarity of someone who'd earned the right to offer comfort even when comfort didn't solve the underlying problem. I know that. And most people know that too, underneath the jealousy and fear. But success in isolation starts looking like selfishness if you're not careful. You've helped Carter, helped Wade, offered Boone a job. That matters and people will remember it. He paused, searching for words that would land without wounding. Make sure they see it. Make sure your generosity is as visible as your success. Otherwise, the story people tell about you becomes the woman who profited while neighbors suffered, and that's not who you are. The advice was sound and pragmatic, and Ellen spent the following weeks making sure her assistance was documented and acknowledged. She bought equipment at Carter's suggestion and leased it to neighbors at cost. She donated to the community food bank using bentonite income. She hired local labor for projects she could have done herself. The gestures were genuine and also performance, attempts to shape narrative in ways that protected against the isolation success had started creating. But underneath, the community management was a deeper awareness that Graham was right about something he hadn't quite said directly. She was succeeding while building walls instead of bridges, was accumulating wealth but not connection, was proving her father right about her capabilities while also validating his worst assumptions about what focusing exclusively on land would cost in terms of life actually lived. 3 years had passed since she'd asked Graham to wait until 1983. 2 more remained before the deadline she'd established, before she'd promised to have an answer about whether postponed relationship could become actual partnership. And sitting in her trailer with financial statements that proved she'd built an empire and community suspicion that questioned whether empire was worth the price, Ellen wondered if waiting until she felt ready meant she'd wait forever. That readiness was something you chose rather than something that arrived on schedule. Graham was right about more than community perception. He was right that success in isolation was just another kind of failure, that building wealth without building connection meant winning a game that didn't actually matter. And somewhere in the cold Montana spring of 1981, Ellen began to suspect that the 5 years she'd asked for might have been 4 years too many. The years between 1984 and the turn of the century passed with the kind of steady accumulation that characterized successful operations, seasons blending into seasons. But the spring of 1982 felt different, felt weighted with possibility that Ellen hadn't allowed herself to consider for the 3 years since asking Graham to wait. Boone was managing the original 80 acres with competence that exceeded expectations, and the terraced badlands were producing at levels that made the investment of 250 hours of dozer work seem almost conservative in retrospect. The 80 acres were generating revenue that exceeded even optimistic projections. Alfalfa yields averaged 4 tons per acre across 3 cuttings. Small grains brought another 40 bushels, and the bentonite royalties that had started at $25,000 annually had climbed to 32 as extraction operations expanded. Ellen's gross income for 1981 had been $58,000, more than her father had ever cleared in his best year managing 1,560 acres, and the mathematics of that reversal contained vindication that should have felt sweeter than it did. Carter drove out on a Saturday in early May, his truck cleaner than working vehicles usually got, and when he climbed out, Ellen noticed he dressed up, clean shirt and boots that hadn't seen mud recently. The formality suggested purpose beyond casual visit, and Ellen gestured him toward the house where coffee was already brewing, and the kitchen table was clear of the paperwork that normally covered it. Carol and I have been talking about what comes next. Carter's words came careful and rehearsed, someone who'd spent time figuring out how to say what needed saying. The mortgage you paid off, that changed everything for us. We're not just surviving now, we're actually profitable. And we want to expand, buy the 40 acres that borders our east fence. But the owner wants cash and we're still building reserves after years of just getting by. He paused, turning his coffee cup in circles on the table. We're not asking for a loan. We're asking if you'd want a partner. You put up the capital, we manage the operation, we split profits 60-40 your favor. It's a good investment, Ellen, but more than that, it's family building something together instead of separately. The offer was thoughtful and fair, structured to benefit both parties while acknowledging that Ellen's capital made expansion possible. She'd accumulated $130,000 in savings from 3 years of bentonite royalties and crop revenue, money that was earning modest interest in bank accounts, but could generate better returns if deployed strategically. The 40 acres Carter wanted would cost around $50,000 at current land values, and if his projections about profitability were accurate, Ellen's share would return $4,000 to $5,000 annually plus land appreciation. But underneath the financial calculation was something more significant. Carter was offering partnership that validated her business judgment while creating connection that went beyond family obligation. This wasn't charity or rescue. It was collaboration between equals who brought different assets to shared enterprise. Ellen found herself agreeing before she'd fully processed the implications, saying yes because the mathematics worked, but also because isolation was starting to feel like prison she'd constructed from her own success. They shook hands across the kitchen table, and Carter's smile carried relief that suggested he'd been expecting negotiation or maybe refusal. Ellen pulled out a checkbook and wrote $50,000 in her careful script, handed it across the table, and watched her brother's face transform from businesslike to something approaching wonder. The money represented security Carter had never quite achieved through inheritance, was investment that trusted his competence while acknowledging her resources, and the balance felt right in ways that pure charity never had. Graham appeared at Ellen's door 3 weeks later, arriving unannounced on a Tuesday evening when the light was starting to fail, and Ellen was finishing paperwork that documented another successful quarter. He stood on the porch looking older than his 58 years, the gray in his hair more pronounced than she remembered and lines around his eyes deeper. But when he smiled, the expression still transformed his face into something warm enough to make Ellen remember what attraction felt like. I'm not here about the 5 years. We've got another year and change before that deadline, and I'm not asking you to give me an early answer. Graham came inside when Ellen gestured invitation, settling into the chair across from her at the table where so many conversations had happened. I'm here because I need to tell you something I should have said a long time ago, and I'm tired of being patient and careful and appropriate. The preamble suggested confession, and Ellen felt anxiety rising in her throat, fear that whatever Graham was about to say would be the thing that broke whatever fragile connection they'd been maintaining through 5 years of postponed relationship. She stayed quiet, letting him find whatever words he'd been carrying. I love you. Have loved you since that first Saturday in Carter's machine shed when you were trying to start a dozer. You didn't know how to operate and were too stubborn to admit you needed help. Graham's voice was steady despite words that felt too large for the small kitchen. I've loved you through every week of these 5 years, through watching you build an empire and push everyone away, through knowing you're choosing land over me and respecting that choice even though it's killing me. And I need you to know that before another year passes, before we get to 1983, and you tell me to wait 5 more years, or that you're not ready or that work has to come first. Ellen felt tears starting before she could stop them, emotion overwhelming the control she'd been maintaining through sheer discipline. The words she needed to say were lodged somewhere between thought and speech, complicated by fear and desire, and the accumulated weight of 5 years spent building success while sacrificing connection. What came out was honest but insufficient, truth that didn't quite constitute answer. I'm terrified of loving you back. Not because I don't feel it, I do, but because everyone I've loved has left or died, and I don't know if I can survive that again. Jack's death broke something in me that hasn't healed right, and asking you to love someone that damaged feels cruel. Graham deserved wholeness she couldn't provide, deserved someone capable of partnership that didn't come wrapped in trauma and fear. But the expression on his face suggested he'd already considered her damage and decided it was acceptable cost of admission. Ellen, I'm 58 years old and I've been around long enough to know that nobody's undamaged. We're all broken in different ways from different things, and partnership isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone whose broken pieces fit with yours in ways that make the breaks less sharp. Graham reached across the table, his hand finding hers with the certainty of someone who'd been waiting years for permission to touch. I'm not asking you to be healed. I'm asking you to be honest about whether you want to try healing together, or whether you'd rather stay broken alone. The question deserved an answer, but before Ellen could formulate words that captured complexity beyond yes or no, the phone rang with the specific insistence of bad news delivered at inconvenient moments. She answered to hear Carol's voice, tight and frightened in ways that made Ellen's stomach drop before words conveyed actual information. It's Carter. He collapsed in the field an hour ago. We're at the hospital in Great Falls. They're saying heart attack, saying it's serious, saying you should come if you can. Carol's control broke on the last sentence, sobs replacing speech, and Ellen was moving toward her truck before the call ended, Graham following without asking, because some situations demanded presence that transcended romantic complication. The drive to Great Falls took 90 minutes that felt like hours, Graham behind the wheel because Ellen's hands were shaking too badly to be trusted with steering. They arrived at the hospital to find Carol in the waiting room, her nurse's uniform still on from the shift she'd been working when Carter's hired hand had called to say something was wrong. The surgical team was still working, Carol reported, trying to clear blockages that had turned Carter's heart attack from manageable to critical, and the outcome was uncertain in ways that made waiting feel like its own form of torture. Ellen sat with Carol while Graham went to find coffee nobody would drink, and the two women held hands in silence broken only by intercom announcements and the institutional sounds of a place where people came to confront mortality. Carter had been 49, had survived foreclosure and reconstruction, had been 3 months into partnership that was supposed to represent new beginning rather than ending. The unfairness of timing was so sharp it felt personal, like the universe had specific interest in proving that building something good meant risking its destruction. The surgeon emerged at midnight, still wearing scrubs spattered with what Ellen recognized as her brother's blood, and the expression on the doctor's face contained the careful neutrality of someone delivering news that could collapse recipients into grief. Carter had survived the surgery, the surgeon reported, but the damage was extensive. 3 blockages had required bypasses, heart muscle was compromised, prognosis depended on factors that wouldn't be clear for days. The surgeon's words were clinical and compassionate, information delivered with the practiced gentleness of someone who'd learned that facts needed softening when the facts were terrible. Ellen stayed at the hospital through the night while Graham drove Carol home to shower and rest, and the hours between midnight and dawn passed in the particular suspension that hospitals specialized in, time moving too slowly and too fast simultaneously. She'd brought Carter into partnership 3 weeks ago, had given him capital that enabled expansion he'd wanted for years, and now He was fighting for life in ways that made expansion seem trivial and partnership seem like bargain she'd entered too late to properly appreciate. Carter regained consciousness the following afternoon, groggy from anesthesia, but alert enough to recognize Ellen sitting beside his bed. His first words were apology, as if heart attack was failure of character rather than failure of physiology, and Ellen found herself crying again, the second time in 2 days after years of maintaining emotional control through discipline that suddenly felt inadequate. "Don't you dare apologize for scaring us." Ellen's grip on his hand was gentle but firm, contact that communicated presence without demanding response Carter wasn't strong enough to give. "You're going to recover from this, going to work the land we just partnered on, going to prove that Merrick's stubbornness applies to surviving heart attacks the same way it applies to surviving everything else." Carter's smile was weak but genuine. "Partnership lasted 3 weeks before I tried to back out through cardiac arrest. That's got to be some kind of record for bad timing." His humor was defense mechanism, someone trying to minimize what had happened because acknowledging severity would mean confronting how close he'd come to permanent ending. "The doctors are saying 6 months recovery, maybe longer, saying I can't do physical work for at least a year. That's not partnership, Ellen. That's you carrying someone who can't pull his weight." The objection was predictable and irrelevant, concern about fairness that missed the fundamental point of why partnership mattered. Ellen leaned close enough that Carter couldn't avoid her eyes, and when she spoke her voice carried conviction that allowed no argument. "Partnership means I carry weight when you can't, and you carry weight when I can't. The money I invested isn't loan requiring payback on schedule. It's investment in family succeeding together instead of separately. You focus on healing, let me and Carol handle operations for however long that takes, and when you're ready you come back. That's how this works." The conversation exhausted Carter into sleep that looked peaceful despite hospital monitors documenting damage that would take months to repair. Ellen sat with him another hour before Carol arrived to take over vigil, and the two women embraced in the hallway with the intensity of people who'd been reminded that time wasn't guaranteed, and that postponing gratitude or connection or any emotion worth expressing was gamble that sometimes got called. Graham was waiting in the parking lot, having spent the last 6 hours in the hospital cafeteria reading agricultural journals and giving Ellen space to be with family. The concern on his face when she emerged was so genuine it made Ellen's chest tight, and when he pulled her into an embrace that felt like shelter from storms she'd been weathering alone, something in her resistance crumbled. She'd spent 5 years building empire in isolation, proving she could succeed without depending on anyone, and Carter's heart attack had revealed how hollow that success became when there was nobody to share relief that catastrophe had been survived. "Take me home." Ellen's words were simple but weighted with implication that went beyond requesting transportation. Graham seemed to understand what she was actually asking, and the drive back to the 80 acres happened in silence that felt comfortable instead of awkward. Two people who'd been circling each other for 5 years finally moving toward instead of around. They stood in Ellen's kitchen at 3 in the morning, exhaustion and emotion combining into state where normal barriers felt irrelevant. Graham made tea neither of them would drink while Ellen sat at the table trying to process events that had compressed years of gradual understanding into 12 hours of crisis. When Graham sat across from her, his expression carried question he didn't voice, leaving space for Ellen to determine what happened next. "I don't want to wait until 1983. The admission came out raw and unplanned, truth that had been building since the hospital but probably longer. Watching Carter almost die made me realize that waiting for perfect timing means risking that timing never comes. I'm 45 years old, and I've spent 5 of them asking you to be patient, while I figured out how to be whole enough for relationship." But Graham, she reached for his hand and found it steady despite her own shaking. I don't think I'll ever be whole the way I was before Jack died. That person is gone. The question is whether you want the person I am now, broken and scared, and still figuring out how to balance building something with actually living in what I've built." Graham's answer came without hesitation, the response of someone who'd been waiting so long for question that answer was automatic. "Yes, I want exactly who you are now, not some imaginary healed version that doesn't exist. We're both damaged, Ellen. The trick is being damaged together and seeing if that's better than being damaged alone." He stood and pulled her up with him, and the kiss that followed carried 5 years of postponed intimacy and present relief that catastrophe had been survived, and something precious was finally beginning. They made love that night with the awkwardness of people who'd been alone too long, and the tenderness of people who understood that physical connection was gateway to emotional territory both had been avoiding. Graham was patient and careful in ways that made Ellen feel safe enough to be vulnerable, and when it was finished, they lay tangled in sheets that smelled like lavender and worked earth, neither speaking, because words felt inadequate for what had just shifted between them. The wedding happened in August 1982, small ceremony at the courthouse in Shelby with Carter and Carol as witnesses. Carter still moving carefully but present despite doctors recommending he avoid stress. Ellen was 45 and Graham was 58, both old enough to know that courthouse weddings were practical and honest in ways that church ceremonies pretended to be. Both aware that the marriage meant combining lives that had been separate long enough that integration would require compromise neither was practiced at making. Graham moved into Ellen's house, bringing possessions that fit in his truck and history that would take longer to unpack. The adjustment was harder than either anticipated, two people used to solitude suddenly navigating shared space, and the small frictions that came with different habits around cleanliness and schedule, and the 1,000 minor decisions that cohabitation required. But underneath the friction was foundation strong enough to support weight, partnership built on 5 years of knowing each other well enough that surprises were minimal and acceptance was default position. The partnership with Carter proved more successful than Ellen had projected. The 40 acres they'd purchased together generated $7,000 in profit the first year, with Ellen's 60% share producing $4,200 that exceeded her investment return if she'd left money in the bank. More significantly, working alongside Carter created rhythm of collaboration that made ranching feel less like solitary struggle and more like family enterprise. Phone calls about crop decisions and equipment repairs. Shared meals where business and personal blended into conversations that covered everything from commodity markets to whether Carol's mother should move in after her fall. Boone's transformation over 18 months was visible and documented in ways that made Ellen proud of decisions that had felt like gambling with resources she couldn't afford to lose. Her youngest brother had gone from suicidal and broken to competent foreman, who managed the 80 acres with efficiency Ellen couldn't have achieved alone. He'd remarried in October 1982, woman from Cut Bank named Susan who worked as a teacher and brought stability Boone's first marriage had lacked. They were talking about kids, about building life that included future instead of just surviving present, and watching Boone reclaim hope was payment Ellen hadn't anticipated when she'd offered him the foreman position. The crisis that had been building across Montana agriculture for 3 years reached breaking point in 1983. Interest rates peaked at 21% in June, wheat prices collapsed to $2.90 per bushel, and the combination meant foreclosure notices appeared in the county newspaper with the regularity of obituaries. Ellen attended 3 auctions that summer, bearing witness, as neighbors lost ground their families had worked for generations, and the specific sorrow of watching community disintegrate was sharp enough that bentonite royalties felt like guilt she couldn't quite justify. Graham accompanied her to the auctions, understanding without being told that Ellen needed presents that didn't require explanation. The third auction was Herman Mueller's place, 480 acres that bordered what used to be Wade's ranch, and Ellen found herself bidding against investment companies and farmers from other counties who saw opportunity in distressed sales. She won the property for $310,000, price that was fair market value but felt like profiting from tragedy, and added the acreage to operations that now totaled 600 acres between her 80, Carter's partnership 40, and the newly acquired 480. The expansion should have felt triumphant, visible proof that Ellen had gone from dismissed daughter with worthless badlands to substantial landowner, whose operation rivaled anything her father had built. What it felt like instead was survivor's guilt, awareness that her success came partly from avoiding mistakes others had made, but also from geological accident that had placed bentonite underground she'd inherited. The unfairness of outcomes cut both directions, and Ellen struggled with the awareness that deserving success and achieving it weren't the same thing, and that timing and luck played larger roles than anyone wanted to admit. Graham found her standing at the edge of the Mueller property 2 weeks after the auction, looking out at fields that would be her responsibility to farm the following spring. His hand found hers without preamble, contact that had become language they both spoke fluently in the year since marrying. "You're wondering if you earned this or just got lucky." His observation came gentle but direct, the kind of honesty that was possible between people who'd learned each other well enough that pretense was unnecessary. "The answer is both, Ellen. You earned it through work that was harder than what most people are capable of, and you got lucky that your father gave you land with bentonite under it. Both things are true, and neither one cancels out the other." Ellen leaned into him, accepting comfort she'd spent most of her adult life refusing, and felt some of the guilt loosening its grip. The Mueller property represented someone else's failure, yes, but it also represented her ability to preserve land that might otherwise have gone to corporate buyers who'd strip mine resources and abandon the ground. She could farm it sustainably, could employ local labor, could be landlord who understood agriculture from operator perspective rather than investment spreadsheet. The decision to offer Wade a job happened after conversation with Graham that lasted most of an evening, working through complications that seemed insurmountable until examined directly. Wade had been in Missoula for 4 years, working construction and apparently staying sober based on occasional reports Carter provided. The divorce from Denise had been ugly but final, and Wade's son from that marriage was in college now, relationship with his father tentatively rebuilt through distance and time. Ellen needed manager for the Mueller property, someone who understood farming and could work independently, and Wade had skills that matched requirements despite history that made hiring him complicated. The phone call to Missoula happened on a Sunday evening in October, Ellen's hand shaking slightly as she dialed the number Carter had provided. Wade answered on the 5th ring, voice carrying wariness appropriate for receiving unexpected calls from family who'd watched him lose everything. "I'm offering you a job. Farm manager for 480 acres. Salary is $45,000 plus housing and benefits. You'd be working for me, which I know isn't ideal given our history, but the work is real and the terms are fair." Ellen delivered the offer without preamble, not because she didn't care about reconnecting, but because business framework felt safer than emotional territory neither of them knew how to navigate. "I'm not doing this because I feel guilty about refusing to loan you money in '79. I'm doing it because you're qualified, and I need someone I can trust to manage property I just purchased. Say yes or no, but don't say no because of pride." Wade's silence lasted long enough that Ellen wondered if the connection had dropped, but then she heard him breathing, heard something that might have been tears or might have been laughter at the absurdity of his little sister, offering him salvation after watching him fail. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he wasn't quite controlling. "Why would you trust me after everything? After I mocked your terracing, after I called you worthless, after I've spent the last 4 years in another state specifically to avoid facing what I lost?" Ellen had thought about this question, had worked through justification that satisfied Graham when she'd tested the idea on him. The answer was complicated and simple simultaneously, mix of pragmatism and belief in redemption that went beyond business calculation. Because you're my brother and you're good at farming and you deserve another chance. Because everyone who lost ranches in the crisis made reasonable decisions that stopped working when variables changed. And punishing people forever for being unlucky isn't justice. And because I remember the brother who was kind, sometimes underneath the cruelty. And I'd like to know if that person is still there or if Missoula construction has killed him completely. Wade returned to Montana in November 1983, gaunt and uncertain in ways that reminded Ellen of Boone 3 years earlier. She met him at the Mueller property on a Tuesday afternoon when early winter was threatening but hadn't quite arrived, and the awkwardness of siblings reconnecting after 4 years of minimal contact was exactly as uncomfortable as she'd anticipated. But underneath the awkwardness was something that looked like gratitude genuine enough to survive expression. And when Wade shook her hand and thanked her for the opportunity, his grip was firm and his eyes were clear in ways that suggested sobriety was holding. The annual Christmas gathering in 1983 brought all three brothers to Ellen and Graham's house. First time since their father's funeral that Merrick siblings had been in same room without someone dying or losing property. Carter was recovering well from his heart attack, moving carefully but moving, and the partnership they'd formed was prospering in ways that validated Ellen's investment. Boone managed Ellen's original 80 acres with competence that exceeded expectations, and his marriage to Susan was apparently happy based on the way they touched each other with casual affection married people either had or faked. Wade was settling into the Mueller property, relearning farming after 4 years of construction work, and the reports Ellen received suggested he was managing competently despite isolation that came with living alone on property that used to belong to someone else. They gathered around the table Ellen and Graham had expanded to accommodate family that had grown through addition and survival, and the meal happened with less tension than gatherings during their father's time. There was laughter and conversation that ranged across topics unrelated to farming, stories about Susan's students and Carol's patients and Graham's extension work that reminded everyone they were people with identities beyond what land they worked. Ellen found herself watching her brothers with something approaching peace, aware that the inheritance that had seemed so unfair in 1977 had ultimately distributed resources in ways that matched capability better than equal division would have managed. Carter raised his glass near the end of the meal, gesture that called attention without demanding speech, and when the table quieted, he spoke with the careful sincerity of someone who'd been thinking about words long enough to get them right. To Ellen, who got the worst inheritance and turned it into the best outcome, who helped each of us when we needed it even after we'd given her reasons not to, who proved that Dad was right about her being the best rancher, even if he was wrong about everything else. We're here, all of us still standing, because she remembered that family means helping even when it's not convenient or smart or fair. The toast was accepted with the kind of emotion that turned 47-year-old ranchers into something approaching tears, and Ellen felt Graham's hand find hers under the table, squeeze that communicated pride and love, and the specific satisfaction of watching someone receive recognition they'd earned but never demanded. The moment should have felt like victory, like validation after 7 years of building success from inheritance everyone had dismissed. What it felt like instead was beginning. Acknowledgement that what she'd built wasn't empire for its own sake, but foundation for family, to rebuild connection, that foreclosures and crisis and their father's flawed decisions had fractured. After the brothers left and dishes were cleared, and the house had returned to quiet that felt comfortable instead of lonely, Ellen and Graham sat on the couch watching snow fall outside windows that framed 600 acres Ellen owned through combination of work and luck and timing. Graham's arm around her shoulders carried weight that was new and good, presence that made solitude she'd defended for so long feel like thing she'd surrender gladly in exchange for partnership that enhanced instead of diminished. You did it. Built everything you said you would, helped everyone you could have justifiably ignored, and ended up with more than your father probably imagined was possible. Graham's observation came quiet and certain, man who'd watched the whole transformation and understood better than anyone what it had cost. The question is what you do now. Keep expanding until your biggest operation in the county, or figure out what success is actually for beyond just proving you can achieve it. The question was one Ellen had been avoiding, because answering required admitting that empire building had been about validation rather than actual desire for scale. The 80 acres she'd terraced were enough land to farm meaningfully. The bentonite royalties were enough income to live comfortably, and the 600 total acres she now controlled felt more like burden than achievement. She'd spent 7 years proving everyone wrong about her capabilities, and now that proof was established. Continuing to expand felt like inertia rather than intention. I think I'm done building. The admission came with relief Ellen hadn't expected, acknowledgement that enough was a destination rather than way station. The terraces are established, the partnerships are working, the family is stable. I'd like to spend the next 20 years farming what I have instead of acquiring more, being married to you instead of married to expansion, actually living in what I've built instead of just building. Graham pulled her closer, and they sat in silence watching snow accumulate on ground. Ellen had transformed from worthless to valuable through labor that had consumed years she couldn't reclaim. The foundation she'd been contemplating, the one that would help women farmers starting from disadvantage the way she had, seemed more important now than adding another 400 acres to operations already larger than one person needed. She thought about women like Jennifer Martinez, 32 years old with 70 acres of dryland wheat who'd written asking for advice about adding irrigation, whose story contained echoes of Ellen's own struggle to transform marginal land into productive ground through work that required resources she didn't have. Maybe the next phase isn't expanding operations. Maybe it's helping other people expand theirs. Ellen spoke the thought aloud, testing how it sounded when given voice. There are women all across Montana doing what I did, starting with minimal land and maximal determination, and they need capital more than they need advice. What if we used some of the bentonite income to fund grants? Not loans, grants. Money they don't have to pay back, just have to use to improve their operations. Graham's expression suggested he'd been waiting for Ellen to arrive at this conclusion, that he'd seen the trajectory before she had. That's legacy, Ellen. That's using success to create more success for people who deserve it but can't access it. The foundation concept took shape that evening, rough outlines of eligibility criteria and funding amounts, organizational structure that would outlast Ellen's ability to personally distribute resources. By the time they went to bed, the vision was clear enough to pursue, and Ellen felt something shift in her understanding of what the empire had been for all along. Sitting here with Graham's arm around her and family reconciled and foundation established that would outlast her, Ellen felt something that might have been contentment, or might have been the exhausted peace of someone who'd finally stopped running from losses they couldn't prevent and started appreciating connections they could choose to maintain. The bentonite would last another 40 years minimum. The terraces would produce crops long after she stopped farming them. The partnerships with her brothers would either strengthen or fracture based on factors she couldn't fully control. But tonight, in this moment, with Graham's heartbeat steady against her shoulder and snow falling on land she'd fought to claim, Ellen allowed herself to believe that proving her father right about her capabilities, while proving him wrong about his distribution, had been enough accomplishment for one lifetime, and that whatever came next could be about living instead of just surviving and building. The years between 1984 and 2000 passed with the kind of steady accumulation that characterized successful operations, seasons blending into each other through rhythms of planting and harvest, and the incremental maintenance that kept machinery running and buildings standing. Ellen turned 50 in 1987, then 60 in 1997, and the passage of time registered more in Graham's gradual slowing than in her own awareness of aging. Her husband was 73 in 2000, moving carefully in ways that suggested joints were wearing out faster than spirit, and the limp that had been barely noticeable when they met had become pronounced enough that stairs required concentration, and long days on his feet left him exhausted in ways that sleep didn't quite resolve. The 600 acres Ellen controlled through ownership and partnership continued producing reliable income that combined with bentonite royalties to generate wealth that exceeded anything their father had accumulated. The original 80 acres of terraced badlands were still her proving ground, the place she returned when decisions required clarity that only came from standing on ground. She transformed from worthless to valuable through work that had nearly destroyed her. Boone managed those acres with the care of someone who understood that opportunity given was different from opportunity earned, and his marriage to Susan had produced 2 children who were learning farming the way their father should have learned it, through gradual apprenticeship rather than sudden inheritance. Carter's partnership had evolved into something closer to friendship than business arrangement. Weekly phone calls that covered everything from crop rotation to whether Carol's mother's dementia was getting worse and what that meant for care arrangements. The 40 acres they'd purchased together in 1982 had appreciated from 50,000 to 90 by 2000, and the profit sharing that had seemed generous when Ellen proposed it now felt perfectly balanced, both parties contributing different assets toward outcome neither could have achieved alone. Wade's redemption had taken longer than Boone's but appeared more durable, the difference between someone rebuilding from catastrophic loss versus someone recovering from complete breakdown. The Mueller property generated consistent revenue under Wade's management, and his sobriety had held for 17 years without the kind of dramatic relapses that marked some recoveries. He'd remarried in 1991, woman named Patricia who worked as a teacher in Shelby and brought stability Wade's first marriage had lacked. They had no children together, but Wade's son from his first marriage visited occasionally, and the reconciliation between father and son seemed genuine if still careful around topics that touched old wounds. The call from Graham's doctor came on a Tuesday morning in March 2003, the kind of early spring day when Montana weather couldn't decide between winter and the coming thaw. Ellen was in the machine shed doing maintenance on the dozer that had started everything, 26 years of use having worn parts that needed replacement if the machine was going to survive another decade. Graham had been at the clinic in Havre for what he described as routine checkup, annual physical, that checked the accumulating issues that came with being 79 years old. The doctor's voice carried the careful professionalism of someone delivering news they wished they didn't have to share. "Mrs. Foster, we need to talk about your husband's test results. There are some irregularities in his cardiac function that warrant immediate attention. We'd like to transfer him to Great Falls for additional testing, possibly a catheterization to determine the extent of blockage we're seeing." The words were technical and ominous medical terminology that, translated to Graham's heart, was failing in ways that required intervention Ellen couldn't provide. She drove to have her faster than conditions warranted, the truck fishtailing slightly on roads still slick from overnight freezing, and found Graham in the clinic waiting room looking smaller than 79 years should have made him. The fear in his expression was so naked it made Ellen's chest tight, and when she sat beside him, his hand found hers with the desperate grip of someone who understood that bodies betrayed everyone eventually, and that time was negotiable only up to limits biology enforced. The testing in Great Falls confirmed what the Havre doctor had suspected. Graham's cardiac function was compromised by blockages that had been building for years, silent accumulation of plaque that had finally reached critical mass. Surgery was possible. The cardiologist explained triple bypass that would give Graham maybe another 5 to 7 years of reasonable function. But the surgery itself carried risks that increased with age, and recovery would be measured in months rather than weeks. Quality of life during that recovery, uncertain enough that choosing surgery versus managing decline medically became a decision that required weighing knowns against unknowns. They sat in the cardiologist's office looking at angiogram images that showed Graham's heart with arteries narrowed to fractions of what they should be, and Ellen felt the specific terror of watching someone she loved confront mortality she couldn't prevent. Graham had been present for every significant moment of the last 21 years, had taught her to accept help without feeling diminished, had proven that partnership could enhance rather than threaten independence. The idea of losing him felt like losing the part of herself she'd only discovered through his patience. "What do you want to do?" Ellen's question came quiet and direct, deferring to Graham's autonomy even though every instinct screamed to demand he choose surgery and fight for every year biology might allow. "This is your body, your choice. I'll support whatever you decide, but I need to hear what you actually want instead of what you think I want you to choose." Graham studied the angiogram images with the detachment of someone examining problems that belonged to somebody else, and when he spoke his voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been dealing with declining health longer than he'd been admitting. "I'm 79 years old, Ellen. I've had a good life. A second marriage that was better than I had any right to hope for. 21 years with you that made everything before feel like preparation. The surgery might give me 5 more years, or it might kill me on the table, or it might leave me diminished in ways that make those 5 years a burden instead of a gift." His hand squeezed hers gently. "I don't want to spend whatever time I have left recovering from surgery. I want to spend it living with you, doing what I can while I can, accepting that bodies wear out and that fighting biology sometimes costs more than surrendering gracefully." The decision was made then, in that office with medical images documenting decline that surgery might slow but couldn't reverse. They chose medical management, medications that would ease symptoms and buy time measured in months or maybe a year, quality prioritized over quantity in ways that felt simultaneously brave and terrifying. Ellen drove them back to the 80 acres that had become home, and the silence in the truck was weighted with awareness that they'd just chosen how Graham's story would end even if they didn't know exactly when. The months that followed had the particular intensity that came from knowing time was finite and counting down. Graham continued working with the extension service through spring, reducing his hours but maintaining connection to work that had defined much of his adult life. He and Ellen traveled in June, driving to Glacier Park and spending a week in a cabin near Lake McDonald, watching mountains and water with the focused attention of people who understood that this might be their last chance to see beauty together. The trip exhausted Graham in ways that made clear his decline was accelerating, but when Ellen suggested cutting it short, he refused with the stubbornness she'd learned to recognize as his way of maintaining dignity against body that was betraying him. By August, Graham was sleeping 12 hours a day, the heart medications keeping him functional during waking hours, but unable to prevent the fatigue that accumulated from an organ working too hard to move blood through vessels too narrow to accommodate flow. He'd stopped driving after nearly passing out behind the wheel in July, and the loss of that independence marked transition from managing decline to being managed by it. Ellen became caregiver in ways that reversed the dynamic of their marriage, helping Graham with tasks that had been automatic 6 months earlier, and the role reversal was harder on him than the physical limitations. They were sitting on the porch in early September, watching sunset paint the terraces in gold and amber, when Graham spoke about what came after with the directness Ellen had learned meant he'd been thinking about subject long enough to need to voice it. "I need you to promise me something. When I'm gone, don't spend the next decade grieving like you did after Jack died. You'll be 66, Ellen. You'll have another 20 years easy, maybe 30 if you take care of yourself. Don't waste them being alone, because you think loyalty to my memory requires isolation." The request was characteristically practical, Graham trying to manage her future from the present, because he cared too much to let her repeat mistakes that had cost them both years they could have spent together. Ellen wanted to promise she'd find someone new, that she'd stay open to connection, but the truth was more complicated. She'd loved 2 men in her life, lost one to accident and was losing the other to biology, and the idea of attempting a third relationship felt exhausting in ways that went beyond grief to fundamental depletion of capacity for starting over. What she promised instead was honesty. "I won't isolate the way I did after Jack. I'll stay connected to the family, to the community, to work that matters." But Graham, she took his hand and felt bones too prominent under skin that had gone thin. "I don't think I have another relationship in me. You're it. The last one. And I'm okay with that, with having had 2 great loves when some people never get one. Don't worry about me being alone. Worry about whether I'll remember to actually live instead of just existing, because that's the thing I'm bad at." Graham smiled, the expression weary but genuine. "You're terrible at it. Worst I've ever seen at someone who's successful at everything except enjoying success." His grip on her hand tightened slightly. "That's why I'm asking. Promise me you'll figure out what the empire is actually for beyond just having built it. You've got 600 acres and bentonite royalties and family employed and partnerships working. At some point that all has to mean something beyond validation, that you were competent enough to achieve it." The observation cut close to awareness Ellen had been avoiding, that building wealth had been about proving capability rather than having particular goal for what capability enabled. She'd spent 26 years transforming inheritance everyone dismissed into assets that commanded respect, and now that respect was established, the question of what came next felt uncomfortably urgent. Graham was right that she was terrible at living, at finding purpose beyond work and accumulation, and his impending death was forcing confrontation with the possibility that success without meaning was just another kind of failure. Graham died on October 3, 2003, at home in the bed they'd shared for 21 years, Ellen holding his hand while his breathing gradually slowed and then stopped in the way that marked transition from person to memory. The hospice nurse had been present, managing pain medications and providing technical expertise Ellen lacked, but the actual moment of death was intimate and private. Just Ellen and Graham and the accumulated weight of 2 decades spent building partnership that had started too late and ended too soon. The funeral filled the Methodist Church in Shelby beyond capacity, testament to how many lives Graham had touched through extension work that had helped generations of Montana farmers. Ellen sat in the front pew with her brothers on either side, Carter and Wade and Boone forming protective barrier against grief that felt too large to manage alone. The eulogy was delivered by Graham's son from his first marriage, man Ellen had met only a handful of times but who spoke about his father with love that validated the person she'd known. When the service ended and the crowd dispersed to the church basement for coffee and sandwiches, Ellen found herself surrounded by people offering condolences that felt sincere but insufficient, words that acknowledged loss without being able to address it. Carter drove her home afterward, the two of them silent in the truck because what was there to say that wouldn't sound trite against magnitude of watching someone you loved die slowly enough to know it was happening, but too fast to properly prepare. When they arrived at the house that Ellen had shared with Graham, Carter helped her inside and made coffee neither of them would drink, and the gesture of presence without demanding conversation was exactly what she needed. "You'll get through this." Carter's words came after 15 minutes of silence, observation rather than platitude. "You got through Jack's death when you were younger and less equipped to handle it. You'll get through this too. It'll take time and it'll hurt like hell and some days you'll wonder if it's worth continuing. But you will, because that's what Merricks do. We survive things that should break us and we keep going because the alternative is surrender and we're too stubborn for that." The analysis was accurate and unhelpful, truth that didn't actually make grief more manageable, but at least acknowledged it was real. Ellen thanked him for staying, for being present without trying to fix things that couldn't be fixed, and after he left, she sat in the house that suddenly felt too large for one person, and tried to figure out how living alone at 66 was different from living alone at 40. Whether the intervening years with Graham had made solitude more bearable, or just made its return more painful. The foundation came together slowly over the winter of 2003 into 2004, idea crystallizing from conversations with her brothers and the lawyer who'd handled Graham's estate. Ellen had accumulated wealth that exceeded her needs, bentonite royalties alone generating $45,000 annually, and likely to continue another 30 years at current extraction rates. The 600 acres would continue producing, whether she farmed them directly or leased them to the partnerships she'd established. Her own expenses were minimal, house paid for and lifestyle modest in ways that meant income exceeded spending by margins that made accumulation automatic. What she wanted was legacy that went beyond just having succeeded, was impact that helped people facing situations similar to what she'd confronted in 1977, when everyone had assumed she'd fail. The Merrick Agricultural Foundation, incorporated in March 2004, with endowment of $500,000, mission focused on supporting women farmers in Montana who were starting with minimal resources. The criteria specified preference for applicants beginning with less than 100 acres, demonstrated competence in farm management, and clear plans for how grant funding would enable expansion or improvement that markets alone wouldn't finance. The first grants went out in fall 2004, 12 recipients receiving amounts ranging from $8,000 to $25,000. Money that bought equipment or enabled land purchases or provided operating capital that banks wouldn't loan to women whose collateral was insufficient by standards that favored male borrowers. Ellen interviewed each recipient personally, wanting to understand their situations beyond what applications documented, and found herself telling her own story in ways she'd avoided for years. The terracing, the bentonite discovery, the partnerships with brothers, the 26 years of building from inheritance everyone had dismissed. One recipient was Jennifer Martinez, 32 years old with 70 acres of dryland wheat and ambitions to add irrigation that would triple productivity if she could finance the infrastructure. Ellen remembered the letter Jennifer had sent 2 years earlier, asking for advice about transforming marginal land, remembered recognizing her own story in Jennifer's situation, and responding with encouragement, but no capital because the foundation hadn't existed yet. Now it did, and Jennifer's $15,000 grant would cover half the irrigation costs, transforming theoretical possibility into actual implementation. "You're giving me what nobody gave you." Jennifer's observation came with tears she didn't bother hiding, emotion too strong to contain behind professional composure. "My father left me the worst ground on our place, and everyone thought he was being cruel. But maybe he knew I'd figure it out if I had to, same way your father knew about you. The grants don't just help us survive. They tell us someone believes we can succeed." Ellen thought about her father's letters often in the years after establishing the foundation, both the one from his will and the one hidden in the dozer for 30 years. The words he'd written about giving her opportunity disguised as disadvantage, about knowing she was the best rancher but lacking courage to say so publicly. She'd been angry about the inheritance for years, resentful of brothers getting land while she got machinery and ground that couldn't grow sagebrush. But sitting across from Jennifer and 11 other women who were fighting similar battles against similar dismissal, Ellen began to understand that her father's choice, however flawed and cowardly, had forced development of capabilities she might never have discovered if inheritance had come easy. The thought didn't forgive him for lacking courage to break tradition publicly, but it complicated anger she'd been carrying for 27 years, transformed it into something closer to melancholy understanding that people were trapped by the times they lived in and the beliefs they'd internalized, that her father had been simultaneously wrong about tradition and right about her capabilities, and that those two truths didn't cancel each other out so much as they created tension no amount of success could fully resolve. Carter's death came sudden and unexpected in June 2008, massive stroke that took him from functional to gone in the space between morning coffee and lunch he never ate. He was 75, had been managing the partnership property until 2 weeks before when he'd mentioned to Ellen that he was feeling tired in ways that rest didn't address. The funeral was smaller than Graham's had been, Carter having been less public in his life than Graham's extension work had made him. But the grief was equally sharp. Loss of the brother who'd been kind when kindness cost him something, who tried to help when the will was read, who'd become genuine partner in ways that transcended business arrangement. Carol took Carter's death hard, 69 years old and suddenly alone after 46 years of marriage, and Ellen found herself in position of providing support to someone who'd supported her through multiple crises. They met weekly for coffee, the two women who'd married Merrick brothers and survived into widowhood, and the conversations ranged across subjects from the trivial to profound, grief processing that happened through accumulated small discussions rather than single cathartic moments. Carol's question one morning in August struck close to something Ellen had been avoiding thinking about directly. "What are you going to do with all of it? The land, the foundation, the bentonite royalties that'll outlast both of us. You're 71, Ellen. At some point you have to figure out succession. Who gets what when you're gone? You don't have children, Graham's gone, Carter's gone. That leaves Wade and Boone and their kids, and figuring out fair distribution that doesn't tear the family apart the way your father's will almost did." The observation was accurate and uncomfortable, forcing Ellen to confront planning she'd been postponing, because confronting mortality was easier in abstract than in specific. She owned 400 acres outright, had partnership interest in another 40 with Carol, managed another 160 through arrangements with Wade and Boone that were structured as employment rather than ownership. The bentonite lease ran another 25 years minimum, royalties that would generate over $1 million in that time if extraction rates held constant. The foundation had grown to $800,000 in assets through contributions Ellen had continued making, endowment that would fund grants indefinitely if managed properly. Dividing it equitably required decisions about what equity meant, whether treating nephews and nieces equally made sense when some had been more involved in operations than others, whether land should stay in family or be sold to fund foundation endowment that would help strangers. Ellen spent months working through scenarios with the lawyer who'd helped establish the foundation, building structures that balanced family interest against larger mission. And the complexity made her appreciate why her father might have defaulted to tradition instead of attempting nuance that would satisfy everyone. The solution she settled on was documented in will updated in January 2009. The original 80 acres of terraced badlands would go to the foundation, sold at her death with proceeds endowing grants in perpetuity. The 400 acres she'd accumulated would be split between Wade and Boone's children, nephews and nieces who'd grown up watching their fathers rebuild from catastrophic loss, and who'd learned farming through apprenticeship rather than sudden inheritance. Carol would receive the partnership 40 acres outright, recognition of 46 years married to Carter, and the support she'd provided when Ellen was building from nothing. The bentonite royalties for the remaining lease term would fund the foundation, passive income continuing to support women farmers for another quarter-century. The structure felt fair and intentional, distribution that honored different kinds of contribution without pretending equality meant identical treatment. Ellen filed the paperwork and felt some of the weight lift, the specific relief that came from knowing that what she'd built would continue serving purpose beyond just having been built, that the terraced badlands that started everything would keep helping people long after she stopped being able to help directly. Wade died in 2015, 73 years old, heart attack that took him while he was checking fence on the Mueller property he'd managed for 32 years. His death was easier than Carter's had been in the sense that Wade had rebuilt from complete loss and had proven that redemption was possible through sustained effort, that the brother who'd mocked Ellen's terracing in 1978 had become someone she'd trusted with significant responsibility. Patricia took his death with the stoic grief of someone who'd been expecting loss without being prepared for it, and Ellen attended the funeral feeling the particular melancholy of outliving siblings who should have outlived her, the randomness of who survived, and who didn't, making any claim of having earned continued existence feel presumptuous. Boone, at 77, was the last brother standing in 2019, still managing the original 80 acres with competence that hadn't diminished despite age that had slowed his movements and made him more cautious about heavy equipment. His children, both in their 30s now, were taking over operations with the gradual transition that marked healthy succession, learning through working alongside rather than inheriting suddenly. And watching them gave Ellen hope that maybe farming could pass across generations without the kind of catastrophic loss that had marked her brother's experiences. She visited Boone on a Saturday in September 2019, driving out to the terraced ground that had started everything 42 years earlier, and found her youngest brother sitting on the dozer that their father had left her, the machine now 52 years old and still running through maintenance that bordered on archaeological preservation. They sat together on the machine that had transformed both their lives, Ellen 82 and Boone 77, and the conversation that happened had the quality of people who knew they were near the end and wanted to acknowledge what the middle had meant. "You saved my life." Boone's words came without preamble, direct enough that Ellen couldn't deflect with modesty or dismissal. "When you offered me the foreman job in 81, I was about 6 months from trying to kill myself again. The first attempt failed because Susan found me, but I was planning another that wouldn't fail, that would finish what I'd started. And you offered me work, offered me purpose, offered me reason to stay alive that was bigger than just not dying. I've had 38 years I wouldn't have had without you. Built a marriage, raised kids, found peace with losing what I lost. That's your legacy, Ellen. Not the acres or the foundation or the money. It's this, people still being alive and functional because you gave them something when they needed it." The gratitude was too large to accept gracefully, and Ellen found herself deflecting with practicality that felt safer than acknowledging emotional weight. "You did the work, Boone. I gave you opportunity, but you're the one who chose to take it and make something from it. Don't give me credit for your choices." Boone shook his head, stubborn in ways that reminded Ellen of their father. "You gave me the choice when everyone else had written me off. That's the thing people don't understand about helping. It's not about solving someone's problems, it's about giving them tools and space to solve their own. You trusted me to manage these acres when I hadn't proven I could be trusted. That trust is what saved me, Ellen. Knowing someone believed I could rebuild even when I didn't believe it myself." They sat in silence after that, two people who'd survived when others hadn't, looking out at terraces that had produced crops for 40 years and would continue producing long after both of them were gone. The specific alchemy that had transformed Ellen's worst inheritance into her best outcome was sitting right here. Machine and land and stubbornness combining in ways that had generated not just wealth but impact that rippled across generations. And sitting here with Boone, knowing he'd found peace after catastrophe, Ellen felt something that might have been vindication or might have been the exhausted satisfaction of someone who'd built legacy that mattered beyond ledgers. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October 2024. Ellen, 87, and still living in the house she and Graham had shared despite offers from Boone's children to move somewhere with more support services. The woman on the phone introduced herself as Carol's daughter Emily, voice carrying the careful steadiness of someone delivering news they wished they didn't have to share. Carol had died in her sleep the previous night, 92 years old and apparently peaceful, heart that had kept beating for nearly a century, finally stopping without drama or warning. Ellen attended the funeral feeling like she was the last one left from a generation that had been large enough to feel permanent. Siblings and spouses all gone now except her, survivor through luck rather than virtue. The church was full of people she recognized but couldn't quite place, faces that belonged to grandchildren and great-grandchildren of people she'd known when they were young, time having stretched long enough that whole new generations had grown up in the space between inheritance and whatever came after. She stood at Carol's graveside next to Carter's headstone, reading dates that marked lives lived fully despite catastrophes that had nearly destroyed them, and felt the weight of being 87 and alone with memories that had outlasted the people who'd shared them. The foundation would continue after she died. The terraced acres would produce for decades more. The nephews and nieces would farm land she'd accumulated. But standing here among headstones that documented who'd been lost, Ellen understood that legacy was less about what you left behind and more about what you'd given people while you were still present to see impact. The foundation had helped 47 women farmers in 20 years, grants totaling $800,000 that had enabled expansion and improvement and survival through markets that punished anyone starting from disadvantage. Jennifer Martinez had built her 70 acres into 240 through careful management and irrigation Ellen's grant had helped finance. 3 other recipients had operations approaching 400 acres. 7 had failed despite assistance, victims of drought or bad timing, or just the randomness that destroyed good operators alongside bad ones. But 40 had survived and most had prospered, and sitting in foundation board meetings hearing their reports made Ellen feel something that wealth accumulation never had. The specific warmth of having resources that enabled helping in ways that actually changed outcomes. She drove home from Carol's funeral through October afternoon that was warm enough to feel like summer despite calendar insisting autumn was settling in. The 80 acres looked good from the county road, terraces still visible after 47 years though softened by grass and time, and Ellen found herself pulling over at the spot where she used to park when terracing was active project rather than completed history. She walked up to the highest terrace, movement slower than it used to be but still functional, and stood looking down at what she'd built with inherited dozer and her father's cryptic faith that disadvantage could become advantage if you were stubborn enough. Graham's voice was still in her head sometimes, asking what the empire was actually for beyond having built it, pushing her to figure out purpose that went beyond proving capability. And standing here at 87 with most of the people she'd loved already gone, Ellen thought maybe she'd finally found answer that satisfied the question. The empire was for giving other people what nobody had given her, for proving that starting from nothing didn't mean ending with nothing, for demonstrating that being underestimated was beginning of story rather than conclusion already written. Her father had been right that she was the best rancher, wrong that tradition required hiding that truth, and the tension between those facts had shaped 47 years of building something that was hers in ways that inheritance never fully was. She'd taken $5,800 worth of machinery and 80 acres of wasteland and turned them into foundation that would outlast her, family that had rebuilt from losses that should have been permanent, legacy that existed in helped lives rather than just accumulated assets. The sun was dropping toward the horizon when Ellen finally turned back toward her truck. She drove home slowly, the autumn light painting the terraces in gold that reminded her of all the seasons she'd watched from this same vantage point. 47 years of transformation visible in the contours of land that had once been considered worthless. That evening, Ellen sat on her porch as she had thousands of times before, watching the last light fade from the sky. The air carried the crispness of October in Montana, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the low rumble of a grain truck on the county road. She thought about Graham, about Carter, about all the people who'd been part of building what she'd built. Her coffee had gone cold in her hands, but she didn't mind. The stillness felt right, felt earned. She was found the next morning by Boone's daughter Sarah, who'd come by to check on her as she did every few days. Ellen sat in her porch chair facing the terraces, her eyes open to the land she'd transformed, the coffee cup still in her hands. The doctor said her heart had simply stopped, peaceful and without struggle, that she'd likely gone watching the sunset over ground she'd made productive through 47 years of stubborn refusal to accept what everyone had told her was impossible. The funeral that followed was attended by family and foundation recipients, and people from across Montana who'd been touched by her life in ways large and small. The eulogy was delivered by Jennifer Martinez, now 52 and farming 240 acres with her daughter, and the speech captured something essential about what Ellen had meant to people who'd started from disadvantage. Ellen Merrick proved that being underestimated was opportunity rather than limitation, that starting with less forced you to become more, that the worst inheritance could become the best outcome if you worked hard enough and were stubborn enough and believed competence mattered more than tradition. Jennifer's voice carried emotion that made several people in the congregation cry. She helped 47 women farmers through foundation grants, but she helped hundreds more through example. Every time someone told us women couldn't ranch or farm or succeed in agriculture, we could point to Ellen and say she did exactly that from almost nothing. That's legacy that'll outlast any of us. The 1967 International Harvester TD-14 bulldozer was donated to the Montana Historical Society Museum in Helena, displayed prominently with a plaque explaining its history. $5,800 worth of machinery in 1977 had become foundation for empire worth millions, had transformed 80 acres of badlands into productive ground, had enabled family reconstruction and foundation that would help women farmers for generations. The dozer sat massive and silent in climate-controlled museum space, paint faded but structure solid, and people who visited could touch the same controls Ellen had gripped for 47 years, while building something everyone said was impossible. The Foundation Board met in December 2024 to determine how Ellen's death would affect operations, and the discovery during a state settlement added $2 million to endowment from bentonite royalties. Ellen had continued directing toward grants even as her own expenses remained minimal. The money would fund scholarships indefinitely, helping women who started from disadvantage the same way Ellen had started, and the board voted unanimously to rename the organization the Ellen Merrick Foundation for Women in Agriculture, recognition that the story and the mission were inseparable. Sarah Merrick, Boone's daughter, stood at the highest terrace of the original 80 acres in March 2025, 5 months after Ellen's death, and looked down at ground her great-aunt had transformed from worthless to valuable through work that had nearly killed her. The terraces were still producing grass and small grains that generated revenue that would continue funding the foundation, and Sarah found herself crying for a woman she'd known but not fully understood until after death had made understanding urgent. She pulled a small envelope from her pocket, letter Ellen had left for her in the will, sealed with instructions not to open until standing on the highest terrace where everything had started. The paper inside was Ellen's handwriting, shaky from age but still legible, words that felt like blessing and challenge simultaneously. Sarah, if you're reading this, you're standing where I stood in 1978 when I first realized what I'd been given wasn't insult, but gift. Your great-grandfather gave me disadvantage disguised as opportunity, and it took me 47 years to understand that maybe that was the greatest inheritance possible. You're farming ground that was built from nothing. You're part of a family that survived catastrophes that should have destroyed us, and you're proof that what I built mattered beyond just the building. Don't make my mistakes. Don't wait until you're 87 to figure out that success means helping others more than it means accumulating wealth. And when people tell you women can't do something, remember that I did it from less than nothing, and that means you can do it too. The land remembers everyone who worked it, but it only honors the ones who made it better than they found it. Make it better, Sarah. That's what Merricks do. Sarah folded the letter carefully and stood watching sunset paint the terraces in gold and amber. And somewhere in the fading light, she felt connected to a legacy that was hers to continue or fail. Choice that would determine whether Ellen's story ended with her death, or kept extending through generations that would farm this ground long after everyone who remembered the building was gone. The dozer was in a museum now. The woman who'd driven it had died watching the land she transformed, but the terraces remained, testament to what one person could build from inheritance everyone dismissed, and proof that the best legacies weren't the ones you planned, but the ones you lived in ways that gave other people permission to try.